I'm Luke Story. For the past 22 years, I've been relentlessly committed to my deepest passion, designing the ultimate lifestyle based on the most powerful principles of spirituality, health, psychology, and personal development. The Lifestylist Podcast is a show dedicated to sharing my discoveries and the experts behind them with you. Dr. Zach Bush, welcome to the show, man.
So glad to be here with you, Luke.
Me too.
So awesome.
I'm so excited. I'm really glad we're able to do this in person. As I was saying, I'm so grateful for technology and Zoom, but there's just something more meaningful every time about sharing space with someone. And before I forget, I want to thank our friend Josh from Wellness Force Radio, who has been so kind enough to lend us his little Japanese-style Zen table here to record. Lovely San Diego, California. And yeah, man, there's so many things I want to cover. It's like I almost don't know where to start because I have a feeling this is going to be a vortex of a conversation that takes us to many different places. But I guess you have to start somewhere. So let's just do this and set the tone. The world is in a crazy place right now. I'm doing my best to frame it as an awakening and the end of an old paradigm and the beginning of a new one. Can be challenging because the old power structures seem to be holding on with a death grip. But let's start with what's new and exciting and positive in your own personal life right now.
I think it's a sense of surrender, ultimately. It's not fun to surrender all the time. It can be painful and frustrating. But never before in my life have I seen an array of such vast number of variables in my life that I can't control. And so everything from my movement around the country and the world to my ability to speak what I feel like is my truth to the ability to connect with family and loved ones to the ability to just breathe real air and see smiles when I walk down the street has been taken away. And so these things are ultimately out of my control, and it leads to this existential experience, but also an opportunity to ask, why did I need those reference points to validate my experience as to where I am and who I am and what I'm here on purpose to do? And I'm realizing that I took a lot from the public engagement and from speaking events where I'm engaging with hundreds or a few thousand people at a time. I was using that global energy of connection to validate my sense of purpose, trajectory of my career, all these things. When all those things get taken away and the world threatens what you think is your identity, it's frightening at moments. It feels really frustrating at moments. But it's also ultimately an opportunity for me to find the deeper me. And that's the opportunity I feel.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely relate to that. It has a lot to do with framing right now. You know what I mean? It's like all about framing, seeing the situation we're in and like finding the lesson in it instead of finding the fear or the frustration. I want to just like jump right in. I've done a few shows about this current situation we find ourselves in. And some of them have been, I would say, not in alignment with the official narrative medically on COVID and the nature of viruses and what's going on and whether or not what's going on really necessitates the losses of freedoms that we're experiencing. But some people have been a bit more moderate. And then I've had David Icke on the other spectrum. It's like the whole thing is a scam. It's all pollution and toxicity. There is no virus. It's all just a New World Order control grid thing, which I don't disagree with necessarily. But I know your perspective seems to be a bit more moderate and in the middle, and you're someone who's deeply spiritual, in my estimation at least, and also someone who's rooted in science. So I thought a great place to start perhaps would be if, and this could be a 5-hour question in and of itself, but just the basics of terrain theory versus germ theory and how that has played into the widely different perspectives we have on this pandemic.
Yeah, this is an old argument that's been alive in academic circles, certainly since the mid to late 1800s. And some of the ones that were made famous were the disputes between Béchamp and Pasteur. And of course, Pasteur ended up winning that kind of general agreement of the argument as he was arguing for germ theory. And he was making the argument that, these bad pathogens are so bad that they can attack any physical body and cause a human person to become ill or die. And so he was looking at things like cholera and things like this. And at the same time, Beauchamp, in his twin studies, was observing that twins with identical genetics were experiencing much different disease paths over their lifetime, and in fact could be in the same environment with the same genetics and have different outcomes from exposure to a single thing like cholera or pneumonia or whatever's going on in the environment. And so he was arguing that it's a terrain of the individual must be much more complex than we were seeing, and that terrain would then dictate the individual's response to the environment. And one of those responses is illness. And I think, this is a little bit of an extension of his argument into a few other, people since then, which is getting into the question of, is that a bad thing to become ill? When you mount a fever and you have this huge inflammatory reaction, your immune system is mobilized in ways which it absolutely is not mobilized in a healthy state. Is there a role for that in survival, longevity, disease resistance, and ultimately wellness? And the answer seems to be increasingly yes, there is a role in that, immune response that's activated by a virus or an interaction with an unbalanced microbiome or whatever it is. And the terrain is then predicting in some ways what you need. And whatever's happening to you right now is what you need most. And the usual reaction to that when somebody says anything about terrain theory is people jump to, oh, well, doesn't HIV kill people? Doesn't Ebola kill people? Or didn't polio kill people? Like they jump to all these historic things that are only understood through a very narrow lens of germ theory. And so we have a story or a narrative around how polio was a virus, and then we mounted an immune system reaction with a vaccine, and therefore everybody became immune to this virus. And then we have this story about HIV causes AIDS. Every peer-reviewed science article that studies HIV, their first couple sentences includes the statement, HIV is the virus that causes the condition of AIDS. And that is there, I can tell you as a researcher and a scientist who spent many years applying for grants, that's how you get your grant, is you say, here's the problem I'm going to solve. And you want to state, in this case, this global pandemic of HIV is related to this end-stage disease process of AIDS. If we just go and look at that one thing, that can't be true because everybody with HIV then would get AIDS. And the fact is, actually, it's quite a small minority of people that will go on to get AIDS who have HIV in their bloodstream. In fact, there's a lot of literature, thousands and thousands of scientific studies that have been done on HIV latency, which is how the HIV virus can just sit inside red blood cells in a non-replicating state and cause absolutely no harm for decades in individuals. And those individuals never seem to go on to pronounce any disease. When we take the HIV virus and we expose any mammal to it, whether it be rodents or monkeys, we've never shown that it can cause AIDS. In fact, for the majority of the time, they don't show any symptoms. In one study so far, they've only been able to show this once, that in this specific simian population of monkeys, they were able to give very high doses of HIV. And ultimately, over time, it took years before they started to manifest situations of immune shift. But they never showed AIDS. They never had Kaposi sarcoma and all of the other things that are actually in the definition of AIDS. AIDS is a syndrome of many different conditions that are actually caused by a host of viruses. And so Kaposi sarcoma is caused by a specific herpes virus. And the leukemias associated with HIV and AIDS are caused by a different herpes virus. And so you've got about 6 or 8 herpes viruses that are in the mix of the syndrome that would be there. And so the statement HIV causes AIDS is actually highly inaccurate at the scientific level. And yet we like to have those reductive statements so that we can get funding, so that we can make that sound like there's a simple problem and we're going to find a simple solution, pharmaceutical adaptation of immune response to HIV or whatever we're studying. And so through this reductionist need we have in science in order to get funding, it's led to this, belief system, this long-running, 100-year-old journey into the belief that there's all of these single pathogens that cause single diseases. And yet that breaks down every time we then try to extrapolate that to another individual. And these studies have gotten extensive. Even as far back as the 60s, they were doing studies where they would find a horse with a viral illness, put a bag over their head and make them breathe into that bag for an hour, and then take that bag and put it on another horse and have them breathe those respiratory viruses for an hour. And they could not get another horse sick, no matter how much virus they exposed them to. And so we can sometimes induce illness in a petri dish, through viral transfection or something like that. But in the terrain of a human body or a horse or whatever mammal you're studying, there's this complex terrain that's going to predict whether or not there's going to be any response to a stimulus. And that's ultimately all it is. A virus, a bacteria, these are stimuli to our immune system. And then our immune system, as a holistic environment, never attacks that thing. That's another misperception, is that there's some sort of warfare for sterility. We're not a sterile environment. We used to think, as of, I'd say 10 years ago, 99% of the docs out there would have said, yeah, the human body's sterile unless it's really sick and a bone marrow transplant unit and the immune system's wiped out. Now you can have bacteria and candy. Genomics has totally changed that, where we now know everything from my liver to my bloodstream, my kidneys, my lungs, even my brain has healthy flora in it. Has healthy bacteria and fungi present in many different forms. In the case of the fungi, I can have yeast forms, I can have hyphal forms, all kinds of different, structures of organic garden happening in every single organ system in the healthy state. And in fact, if I start to eradicate that organic garden from my body, I become prone to those diseases that we would want to prevent. And so if we take a look now at the terrain, as you stated there, of the American population, for example, over the last 30 years, we've seen an exponential rise in almost every chronic disease that's been named today. And that's anything from the neurodegenerative conditions in our elders, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but then in our middle-aged, ALS, MS, then down into our children, the neurologic deficiencies that we see with attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, autism spectrum disorders. And then the blend in there is mood disorders and sleep disorders and sexual dysfunction. All of that is showing that the neurologic function of humanity within a single country that has extraordinary genetic variability and variety is expressing the same, disease in the whole system. And so we can say with confidence that we have done something in the last 30 years to the terrain of humanity within the United States or other Western countries, or developing countries that are adopting our systems of lifestyle, to a terrain that is embracing the need for increased stimulus. We need a ton of stimulus right now to create enough immune activity to survive the toxicity of what we've done.
Wow. Damn. That's a good breakdown. Thank you. That was really a question that I did not know the answer to. Sometimes I feel like I know a little bit about something and I'll ask a guest so that they can inform the unlearned audience. But that one to me is still a little bit nebulous. So thanks for breaking that down in a way that makes sense. So based on that perspective, then one could look at something like a virus, bacteria, fungi, et cetera, that's happening within the terrain as not something that is necessarily our enemy, but could potentially manifest as such if the terrain is dysfunctional and isn't supportive of balance, right? So from that perspective, what is a virus in its essence, and why have they been vilified in our experience?
Yeah. So on one level, this sounds like a scientific discussion and maybe have no influence on your life and be unimportant. But in the last 6 months, I think has shown the world that this is not a scientific discussion anymore. This is one of economics, sociopolitics, and everything else. So our misperception about viruses has been in debate in the scientific environment for well over 150 years. But the last 10 years have been very interesting in that debate, and that we're starting to really realize we miscategorize these things and the science is changing. But in general, it's going to take 20 to 30 years before you really start to see a paradigm shift to when it becomes, the common narrative. So we're somewhere 5 to 10 years into this 30-year journey into making this a common narrative. But right now we have the opposite narrative, which is these things are attacking us and they're the villains. So what I'm about to say is important for all of us, even though it may sound like minutia of biology here. virus is not alive. And that's a super important realization, because for the last 10 to 15 years, the consumer is starting to get buried under, a deluge of information about the microbiome. And so you can now pick up Dove soap and it says it's friendly to the microbiome is their new tagline. Soap that's not how soap works. It's not friendly to the microbiome, but nonetheless, it's become such a prevalent catch term that we see soap companies needing to talk about the microbiome. The problem with this kind of vague notion of the microbiome is it allows the scientific community or the pharmaceutical community or the regulatory communities to put all of the fear of all of the history of infectious disease and history onto these things that we call viruses. And that's a huge mistake scientifically. It's really goes against all of the science currently to be able to do that. But I just want to break it down for the consumer to understand that viruses are not alive. These are genetic packets of information that are targeted towards specific locations. And so any living life form, the majority of which is not human, obviously. In fact, it's not even multicellular. The majority of life on Earth is singular cellular. So you've got single cell forms of fungi in the form of yeast or hyphae or multi-hyphae. And then you get into the weird multicellular things like mycelium of the soils. And then you get into the mushroom. And then you get, this weird new thing that's developed between a mushroom and a plant called the mycorrhizae. And the mycorrhizae are a bizarre structure that is almost like quantum physics in motion in the way that it's able to generate energy from soil and passage it into plants. And the mycorrhizae is, this other huge life form. And then, of course, the bacteria that are riding in all of those different ecosystems is just, boggles the mind in its complexity. The species diversity is just mind-blowing. We're at least 3.5 million, but most of us are starting to realize we're probably closer to 5 million species of fungi. 5 million species, can you think about all of the other life forms on Earth, and then the fungi have 5 million species, And so it's just such vast information. And all of these are able to produce genomic information that we would call viruses. Bacteriophage are at least half of the viruses in the atmosphere that we are breathing all the time. And so bacteriophage are a virus that's secreted by a bacteria or a protozoa or the ancient bacteria called archaea. And so we have this teeming genomic life coming out of the microbiome in the form of genetic information. And it's not alive. I misspoke there. So this teeming, milieu of genetic information spewing out of the microbiome in all of its genomic variability. And that genomic stew is certainly vast in number. We got 10 to the 31 viruses in the air around us. There's another 10 to the 30 viruses in the soil, another 10 to the 31 viruses in ocean water.
Can you break? I think many people, myself included, just are mathematically challenged by a logarithmic numbers like that.
Yeah.
Just for perspective, is there a way you can state that it gives us the magnitude?
Yeah. The answer is no. No human brain can wrap their head around 10 to the 31. But to try to get out that 10 to the 31 is 10 million times more than all of the stars in the universe. So picture billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars. Multiply that now in your head. It's out into the expanse as far as any telescope has ever seen. All of those stars. And now I need to do 10 million of those universes before you reach 10 to the 31.
Okay. That helps.
And so now you're 10 to the 31 of everything that the Hubble telescope's ever seen and beyond. So it's literally more vast than really any other number. Up there are things like, it exceeds the number of grains of sand on beaches of the world, things like this.
Right.
You're in this vast milieu such that there's no breath you take that doesn't have virus in it. And we can show this just in a single system of an infant. An infant that's just born 7 days ago has 10 to the 8th, which is 100 million different viruses in its stool 7 days in.
Wow. That
infant doesn't have the ability to make antibodies. And so this whole story that antibodies are needed to be in relationship or protection against viruses is completely false. We have a really hard time talking about that in science because we've spent 50 years telling everybody that we're going to go and vaccinate them or do something else to create antibodies to protect them from these things. But we have very clear evidence sitting in front of us in just a single infant living before us, taking breath and is in a joyful, healthy state at 7 days of age that cannot make any antibodies to those pathogens. And everybody says, well, they get that from mom through the breast milk or something like that. Well, you go to China, you got 70% of kids on formula. They never see mom's breast milk. United States, we're in that 40 to 50, 60% range. And then you think, well, some of them, we get it from mom to the vaginal delivery, and there's all these other theories of how it goes. But unfortunately, 50% of children born in China are now born by C-section. Some 32 to 40% of Americans are born by C-section. Crazy. And so we are born sterile, and yet we don't stay sterile long. We don't have an immune system from mom because we disrupted mom's immune system at so many different levels. And yet these babies aren't dying of invasive viral infection on day 7. And so we have very good scientific evidence that we are playing on a 2-dimensional chessboard with old science that doesn't hold up to even these basic observations anymore. HIV doesn't directly cause AIDS. HIV is always present in the condition that we call AIDS, but doesn't cause it. It is part of the disruption. Its presence is a sign of disruption of our relationship with the virome. And that we should come back to as a relationship there. But what is a virus? It's a non-living package of information of DNA that's put out into the atmosphere around us or into the water system or soil systems from the microbes. And then multicellular life gets to produce those as well. And so if a mammal will grab one of those genetic updates, and that's the purpose of the virus, that's important. And science has been arguing for years now whether the viruses were the first thing or was bacteria the first thing, that really life on Earth, how did it form? And interestingly, they show up at almost exactly the same moment in the fossil record. So around 3.5, 3.7 billion years ago, we see evidence for bacteria and viruses in the fossil record. Keep that in mind. We can have a fossil record of a virus that's 3 billion years old. And here, we have regulatory science groups telling us, don't worry about the virus if it's been more than 14 days. Like billions of years. Right. Billions of years in nature. Okay. That's a profound observation. There's a long lifespan to viruses, and they've been here long before we ever showed up. And in fact, we could not have showed up without the viruses. The virus's purpose is to swap genetic information quickly across species. Inside of species is actually, you don't even need a virus. The bacteria and the archaea, which were the kind of predecessors to the more complex modern bacteria, archaea starting 3.5 billion years ago, learned how to swap genetic information between friends, if you will, of the same generation very quickly. So instead of genetically passing down information through a lineage of reproduction, they learned how to do what's called horizontal gene transfer. And they started passing genetic information all over the place. And this can be seen in a modern hospital system with antibiotic resistance. And so if there's a bacteria within the hospital that suddenly develops an adaptation that allows it to resist the function of an antibiotic that's in the environment, it can now start passing that genetic adaptation to all of its friends nearby. If it wants to go trans-species with that, it needs to use a virus. So then a bacteriophage is produced, and it will target that genetic update or that genetic opportunity for adaptation and variability out into the environment, and it will tag it to where it intends it. It will put surface proteins that it will be picked up by a specific other species, by a specific other receptor. In the case of coronavirus, we will produce the common cold out of coronavirus all the time. And the coronavirus targets a very specific receptor within our lungs and with our vascular tree and beyond, and it's called the ACE2 receptor. And so the ACE2 receptor is normally expressed on all these tissues, and the virus is produced in an envelope that's tagged with an ACE2 antigen so that it will bind to that receptor and be delivered specifically into our lung and vascular system beyond to update the genetics of that individual. And so if it was a malicious act, then no species would want to take that up and replicate it. So we've developed the most regulated process that's ever been studied really at the genetic level happens in these ribosomal RNA. And so the RNA is what will transcribe, the ribosome is what will transcribe the RNA into a protein and then make it functional. The virus is not only not alive, it's not functional until it's taken up by its host. So let's picture, somebody in China who's starts to breathe in, particles of coronavirus, finds a necessity for creating an immune response in its body or updating a genetic pathway within the red blood cell or the hemoglobin protein or any number of processes, and they shift that they take that up, and in their need for that virus, they start producing more of it. And so they start exuding it throughout their whole body. And then they'll send it out specifically tagged for other mammals. And so mammals start taking up this virus all over the place and will adapt to that very quickly. As we've seen with this current, corona outbreak, most people who are exposed to that virus and will have, an immune response to it, they never recognize any illness. Most of them are asymptomatic. Another significant portion are mildly symptomatic. They have a few days of fatigue and headache, and then it's gone. Then a few will have headache, fatigue, cough, some shortness of breath, and then a very, very few will actually present with, really acute illness. What's happening in all of those individuals that are breathing that thing in and never become symptomatic is this extraordinarily regulated process where the RNA will, the virus getting into the body, each cell will decide whether it's going to make the proteins from that virus or not. And it's going to decide whether it's going to integrate that genetic information into our genome, which gets really interesting that we could start, passing this genetic information within a single generation to each other, or within our body at least, to other liver cells or other lung cells or whatever it is, through horizontal gene transfer and other things. And so we can quickly move these genes around the body to where they're most needed. Now, occasionally, these will lead to such an important adaptation that they get recorded in the DNA of our reproductive cells. So the sperm or the ovum can take in new genetic information and pass this on. A famous update that I can point to is the iPhone gene got inserted in my children's generation. I still don't know how to use an iPhone, but they were born knowing how to use that thing. So there was some genetic update that happened that allowed this moment to happen, and suddenly everybody knew how to use an iPhone. And so this, adaptation of human behavior actually can be seen down at the genetic level through the whole history of mammals. And so the first mammalian birth, it turns out, could not have actually happened without a retrovirus. And so a retrovirus got inserted into the journey towards mammal millions of years ago. And this RNA virus allows for a protein to be produced that allows the transcription device for the genome to be able to jump across bumper blocks. My liver cells always have to make liver cells because of the bumper blocks that hold the transcription mechanism in place. This RNA virus suddenly allowed that to move, and we started to, at that moment, develop the ability for stem cells. And so stem cells led to this huge pluripotent capacity for regeneration and repair. So the first stem cells are due to a retrovirus, actually, like HIV, getting adapted not just into single cells in the organism, but actually into our reproductive cells at that point. But interestingly, the placenta, being necessary for that first mammalian birth, also needed an RNA virus to make it possible for its formation. And so these are just two of thousands and thousands of examples of viruses that built us. And without them, we would have never developed the biology of what we think of as human today. We now know that over 50% of the 20,000 genes that we call human are inserted. We've been able to map them directly back to insertion from viral genome. So 50% of the human DNA is the result of direct manipulation or insertion of viral intelligence. And we have good evidence that the viruses, as this mechanism of adaptation, is always pushing for one thing, which is biodiversity, and at the same time, somehow an increase in consciousness. And I would argue that based on some really bizarre things that happen when we go extinct on this planet. And so extinction events on planet Earth have happened 5 times. We're in the middle of our 6th great extinction here. And after each great extinction, something amazing happens, that instead of the Earth like struggling to get back to its previous normal, it for some reason does life better the next time around. It does it faster, it does it through more biodiversity, and there's always this higher level of intelligence seemingly, or at least a capacity for it within the biology on Earth. Now that gets us back to, how does a virus get produced in the first place? Why would an organism, a bacteria or a human, produce a virus? And the answer is stress. If all is well, then there's no reason for us to send out new genetic adaptation. But if things are going bad and the environment's toxic because there's too many volcanoes that went off, or there's a huge cataclysmic asteroid that hits 55 million years ago, or whatever it is, right now there's so much chemical being dumped into the planet that's killing the entire microbiome. And so the amount of stress in a pig facility, for example, in a pork facility is is just astronomical. You can't even calculate the level of extinction stress in a pig farm. And so that level of extinction stress leads to this massive explosion of viromic communication, because all of the organisms in there, billions of bacteria, billions of fungi, billions of cells of pigs or chickens or humans being raised in these toxic environments, are desperately looking for the survival benefit to get them out of the extinction event. Or, if extinction is inevitable, to leave a record of life that would allow life to come back more resilient and beautiful.
That's some Star Trek shit right there. That's wild. And when you speak of the a farm, because I know you do work with farmers and that's part of your mission. I mean, we're talking about and I want to back up even further, but just on top of mine, we're talking about a classical factory farm that is just based on output and has nothing to do with considering the environment or the animals or the finished product and its effect on people, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can see the stress at almost in any farm now, unfortunately, just because the environment's become so toxic. Mm-hmm. So we have, the most ubiquitous herbicide on the planet is now Roundup, or the active ingredient Roundup, which is glyphosate. And that's now the active ingredient in almost every weed killer on the market worldwide. We are using somewhere around 4.5 billion pounds a year of this chemical. And we're pouring it right into our soil. And it functions as an antibiotic. And it's water soluble. And so this gets carried into the groundwater. It gets put into our fossil aquifers that are contaminated now. It gets put into our river systems and ultimately into our oceans. And in that process, it actually evaporates. The large amount of that water goes into the air. And so we're breathing Roundup. 75% of the air samples taken in the United States are now contaminated with Roundup. So that then goes into our clouds, consolidates, and rains back down. And 75% of our rainfall is contaminated with Roundup. And so we are breathing it, we're drinking it, it's raining on us. And so that's why I point that out, is because you ask, well, is this just factory farms? Unfortunately, our most organic, grass-raised finished animal, or the organic produce, being grown down the road, is being rained on or be watered by water that's not just contaminated with Roundup, but 164 other herbicides, pesticides, and agricultural chemicals, compounded with another 160 different chemicals from the cosmetics industry, another 120 chemicals from the washing of clothes. Just the amount of apparel chemical ooze is disgusting. The amount of that ends up in our bloodstream is disgusting. You go do yoga in your stretchy yoga pants, and you don't know you're absorbing all these microplastics in your bloodstream, but it's inevitable because you absorb them
into your through your skin, the microplastics,
especially as the pants age. And so when you develop any plastic-based clothing that has that petroleum base in it, it's going to be friable. And if you look under an electron microscope at the masks everybody's wearing right now, those melt-blown plastic mesh that's inside that mask to create the filter is this nanofiber plastic that looks a lot like what you would find in apparel, but disorganized. Apparel has its appearance because of its organized, production of it. In melt-blown plastic, mask, you're blowing it almost at random against a spinning screen to create that random mesh down at the nano. But in the end, you've got these microfilaments of plastic that, as they flex, and especially if they heat up by the heat of your breath, in the case of a mask, or the sweat on your skin through yoga, they become friable. And so these little microplastic nanoparticles are breaking off your clothing all the time. And the skin is relatively good at being a barrier to the outside world until, ironically, it's exposed to things like Roundup, which break down our barriers of our skin and our gut. And so now we're drinking microplastics, we're eating microplastics, and these are all endocrine disruptors, And so downstream of glyphosate, which is, I would say the most toxic chemical on the planet for certainly its ubiquitous nature, but also because of what it does. Its function at the biological level of humans or animals that are consuming it is that it breaks apart our barriers. And so it breaks apart the gut barrier, the vascular barrier, the blood-brain barrier, the kidney tubules. So we become sieves or sponges for toxin, and we lose the ability to excrete those toxins through our kidneys or through our sweat or otherwise. And so through the breakdown of these barriers, we become these sponges for all the toxins. So I see glyphosate as the gatekeeper. I was super excited to see the Minister of the Environment of Mexico come out about 2 weeks ago now to announce that Mexico is banning glyphosate and Roundup in Mexico by 2023.
Really?
And so super progressive. He's matching France's goal. France wants to get it out of their country by 2023. There's this misperception that Europe doesn't use Roundup. That's not true. All the European countries have. Germany's trying to get 2025 to be their organic target and all of this, but it looks like Russia is going to probably be the first country there, way ahead of everybody.
So funny.
Yeah,
I heard that. It's like we think of Russia as this totalitarian, archaic culture and government, and then now they're becoming the leaders of liberty. It's just bizarre. Everything's backwards.
Well, they're the leaders of technology. Isn't it ironic that no president over the last 3 presidents has mentioned that we outsourced our entire space program to Russia?
Really?
That's where we launch all of our astronauts from. This is where we train all of our astronauts ever since we shut down the shuttle program. And nobody knows that. And so it just drives me crazy that crazy. Here these presidents are vilifying the Russians while they've spent literally, I think the last number I saw was like $15 billion building Space City outside of Moscow. The U.S. has spent that kind of money in Russia because they have the best engineers and they have the best mathematicians and they're the best space program in the world. And so this rise of Elon Musk and SpaceX and all that was the only answer we had. The reason why that was allowed to happen, why NASA backed off and started inviting the public sector into this thing and giving stimulus, the government started giving stimulus and creating space for private sector, is because they couldn't do it themselves. They don't have the engineering prowess of the Russians. And so, just across all of these things, I just think there's this hubris of Americana that's keeping us from participating in the future.
Right.
And we're locked in a past. And nowhere is that more clear than what's happening in the pandemic. We're controlling the global narrative with science that's literally 30 to 150 years old.
Well, I want to delve deeper into that. And I really want to get into the Roundup issue too, because I know you're such an advocate for that. But before I go back, I want to circle back to the virus issue a little bit. But I have one question about the Roundup thing. So France is going for this initiative to ban it. Mexico's following suit. Russia as well. I'm assuming that would be inclusive also of the Bayer kind of like what was it called? Like the Liberty spray or something?
Liberty Link.
Okay, yeah. It's like the rebranding of it, is it not?
No, it's not. Actually, it's scarier than that.
It's worse. God damn it.
Yeah. Just when you thought you heard the bad news from me, I'll up the ante on you. So Liberty Link, I think, is why Bayer, and this is total supposition here, but why did Bayer come along to buy Monsanto when Monsanto was really on a catastrophic downfall of good PR? They had already been vilified by the American public. They were, being, sued beyond, their capacity, all of this. And so the U.S. court system had upheld those blocks on those court cases for decades, basically continuing to quote Monsanto's own science to say, no, this is all BS, this is BS. And then, of course, right at the moment they finally sell to Bayer, the U.S. court system lets off the brakes, and we see the first court case finally go to a jury. No judge before that moment had allowed this to go to a jury. And, of course, the jury settled that $250 million case for the complainant, which nobody was told. But 30 days later, that judge downgraded that $250 million to $30 million without telling anybody. Just made a unilateral decision as a judge that he could, that $250 million is unreasonable, and made it a $30 million
oh my God.
Settlement. And so, it's this kind of, public appearance, trauma, though, that this company then goes and buys Monsanto. So why would they do that? So 2 years before they go to buy Monsanto, they finally get approval for Liberty Link, which is their new GMO chemical in crop. And so they got approval from the EU and the USDA, Canadian regulators and Australian regulators over a 5-year effort to get this new genetic modification into the crops. And so if you remember, GMO didn't used to be called GMO. It used to just be called Roundup Ready crops. Because nobody in 1996 really knew what genetic modification was. That wasn't part of our public lexicon. But Roundup Ready was easy for people to understand because our homeowners by 1996 were all spraying Roundup in their backyards and everything else. And to have plants that would be resistant to that would be really beneficial for farmers. So they created the Roundup resistant genetically modified crops with corn, soybean, and now there's over 30 or 40 species of plants, including things like petunias and roses, have been genetically modified to handle Roundup now. So,
dude, I was going to, side note real quick, I got to interrupt. I was going to ask you about that. I've always wondered if when you go to a florist and buy flowers, if when you're smelling them, if you're inhaling Roundup, do you think that's likely?
Oh, yeah. You're touching it, you're absorbing it, you're breathing it. Yeah.
Brutal. All right.
Yeah. And not just Roundup, obviously. There's so many chemicals used on roses. They're easily, one of the most toxic, flowers you can touch.
So if you really love someone, get them some wildflowers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. So back to the Liberty.
Well, actually on that, I just want to give a shout out to, Texas Children's Hospital invited me down there in Houston last year to just tour their grounds. And it turns out it was none of their doctors. It was not their oncology ward. It was none of the people that you would think would be interested in, having a former cancer research guy come in. It was their landscapers. One of their head landscaper had heard one of my talks and realized, overnight that he was delivering Roundup into every hospital room in the country because he had been a part of the think tank that had developed for Texas Children's Hospital and Texas Hospital Houston, University of Texas Houston, the policy that every room would be delivered a fresh rose every day. And it was heralded through everybody like, what a cool thing to do for every patient in the midst of chemo and everything else, to give them all a fresh rose every day. And he realized he was delivering fresh glyphosate Roundup, into every room every day.
Brutal.
Because it's not just covering the plant. Remember, it's absorbed up into the water structure of the plant. So it's like ever present in that thing. You can't rinse off the Roundup. And so in that, he decided he was going to, work with his crew. And over the last, I think it only took them 2 years, but there's 610, acres of their property around their hospital system is now 99% glyphosate free, including their rose gardens and things like that. And
that's cool.
I think it's really neat that our farmers and our landscapers can be decades ahead of our medical scientists and doctors in recognizing we should not have chemicals in our environment. We should not have chemicals around humans that are sick. And so how that's an easy jump for them and such a difficult jump for my colleagues and I to make that transition, I don't understand. I don't know what it is, what kind of brainwashing it is, or what we're afraid of. What are we afraid of to acknowledge that toxins in our environment are probably causing sickness? I'm not sure what the resistance is entirely, but I think there's a fear that we don't know. And that's probably, I guess, as I think about it just in real time here, this probably needs to be corrected later, but in real time, when you're a physician and you're asked to be at the bedside and make life and death decisions and what feels like life and death decisions anyways, there's a high level of sense of responsibility there. And if you start to acknowledge that, our current narrative on sicknesses come from viruses and bacteria, if that's not true, then I don't know what's true. And that's going to make me really insecure at the bedside. And so that's maybe why we retract from new information, is we need to feel really confident that we know the right paradigm, because we have to go and make these split-second decisions that could mean life or death for our patients. And then we have to acknowledge when we start to see, and I had to go on this journey myself, when I started to realize that, I had young people who had committed suicide under my care and things like that, there had been loss of life due to the lack of good tools and the lack of holistic understanding I had of those patients, and the lack of time I had to listen to those patients. And so those things weigh on you as a human being when you're like, man, I just don't have the right toolbox, and yet I'm being put in this environment of life and death decisions and people are dying. And if I knew better, then maybe they wouldn't die in the same way, or maybe they'd live longer, healthier lives. It's a lot to put on an individual. And so maybe we just need to stop for a moment and just write a huge permission slip to all the physicians, scientists, nurses, everybody else working right now as we see this COVID thing sweep through it and everything else. It's okay that we're screwing this up, because we've been screwing it up forever. Like, this isn't new mess up. Like, we have a long history of science being a process, not a data bank. Science isn't like the truth. Science is literally just a process, and it's kicking out new information all the time as it marches through space and time. And we do our best as scientists and physicians to react to that information. But like I said earlier, we know it takes 20 to 30 years before we see a cohesive new paradigm defined in the science realm, basic science and beyond, for that to trickle into real, decisive change at the clinical level, 20, 30 years minimum. But now we're talking about something that's not just like stepwise progress. We haven't seen this big of a scientific disruption since, I'd say, the 1600s, when we found out the planet was not at the center of the universe. With the invention of the telescope, we suddenly found out the universe was spinning around, or we were spinning around in a universe rather than it, circling us as the center of the universe. In the same way, we're suddenly looking through our microscopes now, realizing, oh my gosh, the human cell is not at the center of life, of the human. if we're not at the center of life of human, what is? And the answer is the microbiome is at the center of life of human. And if we start to deplete that microbiome, human life starts to deteriorate. And so does earthworm. Earthworm's not at the center of earthworm life. The microbiome is. And what is the microbiome? The microbiome is an ecosystem of tens of thousands, if not millions, of species that are intercommunicating at any given moment to decide how to make hyperintelligence happen. So this really complex ecosystem that you start to elicit consciousness. And we can see the destruction of consciousness by something as simple as an antibiotic. One course of antibiotics will cause an increase in major depression over the next 12 months of 17%, increase in anxiety by 24%. If you have 2 courses of antibiotics, I would increase your risk of major depression by 44% and your risk of a generalized anxiety disorder by 52%. And so just with a simple course of 3 days for sinusitis, I can change your level of mood stability and your sense of connection to self. And depression, being that classic disconnect from self, is elicited by a simple antibiotic, a few days of antibiotic. And so when I say human's not at the center of human, it's quite literal. We cannot have even our connection to our sense of self without the microbiome.
Wow. Damn. So I'm still curious with the Russia, Mexico, and France and this Liberty Link. Are they also going to block that because it is as bad, if not worse, as a chemical to have in the environment? Or are they just like, it's not Roundup, so it's okay?
This is why I think Russia is kind of ahead of the curve. Russia's really going for being the first organic country. And so that means they're going to have no small chemical molecules allowed. So that would rule out Liberty Link, atrazine, 2,4-D. 2,4-Ds, like atrazine and 2,4-D are the most used chemicals in the U.S. now because Roundup is failing us. We've sprayed so much Roundup that we're now causing that gene transfer that I talked about earlier. And the plants are literally horizontally passing gene transfer for resistance to Roundup now. And so here we genetically modified for Roundup ready crops to be resist that Roundup or to be resistant to the Roundup. Now that those plants have taken that genetic information and started to pass it horizontally to the weeds and the rest. And we have this,
so everything's turning Roundup ready.
Yeah. And in 3 or 5 more generations, we might have humans, if we're still alive, that are Roundup ready. We might be able to genetically adapt to Roundup. It's possible.
Right.
It'd be tricky because we're going to have to fix a lot of things because we don't actually have the machinery that Roundup was supposed to attack. So therefore, it's going to be hard for us to adapt because most of the viromic information or genetic information that's coming for adaptation that's allowing plants to adapt are around something called the shikimate pathway. It's an enzyme pathway that plants and fungi have. We unfortunately don't have that pathway. And so we can't actually even do the work of that pathway. And so whatever adaptation we would have to find to be Roundup ready is not going to be the same as the plant. So it would take a lot of viromic information. We're going to have to produce a lot of virus before we find, a genetic adaptation to all of these chemicals. Glyphosate and 2,4-D and atrazine are interesting. 2,4-D is another, 2,4-D is the racemic it's the mirror image of Agent Orange. And so we're spraying our crops now with Agent Orange, which is not very different than glyphosate because both are organophosphate molecules. And so, but 2,4-D is really the same molecule as Agent Orange, just flipped over. But, glyphosate being the most ubiquitous, Agent Orange, organophosphate-like molecule, all of these are disrupting the ability of these soil organisms, plant organisms, to make the essential amino acids, which, again, we can't make because we don't have that shikimate enzyme pathway. So we call them the essential amino acids because those 9 amino acids we have to get from our food or from our gut flora. If they can't make it for us, we'll never get it, and we'll start misspelling proteins. There's only 22 amino acids, which is a very small alphabet to build 280,000 different proteins that the body needs to produce in a healthy human body. So there's 22 letters of the alphabet of those amino acids that can be rearranged to spell these different proteins. 9 of those are the essential amino acids, and a significant portion of those essential amino acids are made by that shikimate pathway. And so Monsanto has been getting away, and now all the chemical companies in the U.S. make that chemical, by the way, Dow and certainly 3M, and all those chemical companies are making some form of glyphosate compounds out there. And so glyphosate, being that disruptor of the shikimate pathway, and now, every weed killer in the world doing this, we're starting to, over the last 30 years, build an entire soil system and food system that is deleted of a few letters of the alphabet. And those alphabets that are really functioning as the vowels that show up on almost every single protein are those essential amino acids. So 3 of those are phenylalanine, tryptophan, and tyrosine. And these are made by the shikimate pathway that's blocked by Roundup. So imagine taking 3 of the vowels out of the alphabet and what would happen to the spelling of the English language. And so we've got, about the same number of letters, a few more letters in the alphabet, but then you have, these 5 critical vowels. And if you start deleting those vowels, you literally will start misspelling every protein. And when you misspell a protein, you decrease its function or you completely eliminate its function. But in most cases, I think it's, just a deformed protein, and so it loses its functionality. And so we can have a lot of misspellings and still tolerate that to some degree as far as building a baby, but their resilience becomes deficient because they can't detox at the same rate. They can't, produce metabolism and energy for repair and regeneration at the same rate, and all these things. So in this very insidious way, we had a chemical that, the tagline was, it's safer than water. And when they were asked, why is it safer than water? It was because humans don't have the shikimate pathway and it poisons the shikimate pathway. Well, that was short-sighted, thinking that it only did one thing. But more than that, isn't it short-sighted that the EPA never asked, well, what does the shikimate pathway do? And what's going to happen if we block the shikimate pathway in soil systems and plant systems? Oh, by the way, you're going to start to have fetuses that misspell all the proteins in there. And of course, that's tragically what we're seeing, is our children are now born aged. They are born with an old genomics. And so they start aging quicker. They start developing diseases that we didn't see until our 80s by the time they're 5 or 8 years old. And so we've got this exponential rate of aging at the cell, this lack of repair happening. And I believe it has a lot to do with this epigenetic patterning of a lack of amino acids to begin with and a stress signal increasingly coming out. And when we do rodent studies with this, we just presented this data again to the EPA. There's 3 great studies that have been done showing generational effect of glyphosate in rodents. And what you see is in the first generation where you expose the grandmother in this case, mouse 1, there's no change in lifespan. She has normal pups. She has no diabetes or cancer. Everything looks good. That second generation of pups, however, very early on in life start to have metabolic dysfunction. They develop obesity. They develop dysfunction of the immune system. They start to really show some major stress. The third generation, tragically, is born with massive birth defects, stillborn, or cancers early on. The scary thing is we have not seen the third generation of Roundup children yet. Oh. And so we can show that in rodents. We're probably looking at second generation right now. So the children that are now exhibiting in the United States in our recent Medicaid surveys, we're showing that 52% of American children have some sort of chronic disorder or disease, compared to 1.2% in the 1960s. So 52% of children in generation 2 either have allergy to the air they breathe, they have allergy to the food they try to eat, they can't breathe, they can't eat without being overreactive. That's not good. You mentioned Star Trek earlier, and it always comes to mind when we get to this part of the conversation, because I have this distinct memory of this almost exhilarating goosebump moment when Spock, wires back into the Enterprise and says, "Good news, this can sustain life." This planet is getting to the point where Spock would show up and be like, "Bad news, can't sustain life."
Right.
We're losing the very fundamentals of biology because it can't produce amino acids for humans to develop in. We're literally at that tipping point, and that's why great extinction events happen on the planet. The 5 great extinction events weren't because the asteroid hit all the animals. It's because there was enough of a death of topsoil that we lost the generative effect of the microbiome, and we couldn't make the amino acid pool and the intelligence of nature really, exert itself. And so we lose that fundamentals. And so we're at this, scary tipping point. And in the next, 10, 20 years, we're going to see that third generation of Roundup babies born. We have no idea how bad this thing gets. Currently, in second generation Roundup, we're looking at, somewhere between 1 in 25 and 1 in 35 children with autism spectrum disorder. 1 in 5,000 in 1975, right before we debuted Roundup. And so we've gone from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 20, and we're on the steepest climb in that trajectory of autism spectrum disorder has been from 2012 to present. On our current trajectory, even if we don't have a worse scenario in the third generation of Roundup kids, we could hit 1 in 3 children with an autism spectrum disorder in the United States by 2035. So we're 15 years away from really the elimination of a generation from productivity as a nation. So if you want to zoom back from the humanitarian crisis there, the health crisis, and just look at it as just pure economic situation, we collapse as an empire at that moment. There is no economy in the world that can support 1 in 3 children with autism. At the same time, we're supporting this rise in cancer to the point of 80% of adults with cancer. That is fiscally insoluble. And so it doesn't take imagination anymore. We can simply say these are the steps that are happening. And then a lot of people, challenge me like, Zach, why you just keep marching around telling people they're going to go extinct? Like, that's a bad intro line, because nobody believes that. And of course we can't believe that, because we look around and there's 7.8 billion people. So how could we possibly go extinct? Especially because you keep saying it's like 60 or 80 years away. Don't say that, because you don't know. And I don't know, but I can certainly show you the line of how we get there. And that line is very short. Like, it started just in the 1970s. And if you look from the 1970s, again, the debut of glyphosate being 1974, 76, debuted in 74, but didn't really get sprayed extensively in the US and Canada until 76. So 1975 is like kind of one of my metric dates of like, okay, this is kind of pre-glyphosate. And at that moment, the average sperm count in all Western nations on average was around 100 million sperm per deciliter or microliter. And so you then fast forward through that first and then maybe the second generation of males now coming out under glyphosate era, and we're down to 48. So we've had 52% decline in sperm counts, not just in the US, but in all Western nations over that short period of time. We now have 1 in 3 males with sperm counts in the infertility range in all Western nations. 1 in 3 males infertile by sperm count in Western nations across the world. When was the last time you saw a politician concerned about that? When did that come up on the radar screen of public health? I can't believe that we just paused the entire economic force of the world over some story of a vilified virus, and not over the story of we're going extinct and 1 in 3 males is already infertile, and in another 40 years, we aren't going to be able to produce a baby.
Right.
Like that. It amazes me that we are that short-sighted that we can't even look forward 20 years. Like I show you the chart for autism per year, and scientists will say, well, we're over-diagnosing it. We've changed the diagnostic. They come up with all these rationalizations instead of coming to terms with, we might be doing that. It is quite possible that we are doing this to ourselves, and we should do something about it. But we don't. We just keep kicking the can down the road because we can't even look forward 15 years and agree, let alone 40 years and agree. The only thing that brought the world to an end was something that was threatening our life right now. They said this could kill millions of people tomorrow. That seems to be within our timeline of imagination to cause a transformative event.
Well, it's interesting too how, so much of this seems to be based on the Ferguson computer projection model that is just on its face much more fallible than everything you just said. You know what I mean? It's like you just made a better case than that, and the whole world is like, following that for someone that's been wrong multiple times before with such models. I think this is the challenge for me as someone who wants to believe that at the core of all people is good, and that some people have been misled through their own trauma, their own experience, their own limited perspective. But with information out there like this, it seems that it can't just be humanity's stupidity that's leading us so astray, that there seems to be, a systemic issue of incentivizing research, decisions, laws, etc., for the purpose of greed and wealth. And when you look at the medical system, there's so many amazing MDs like you that are conscious and progressive and want change and really care about people and their patients and working steadfastly to bring about new ideas and perspectives. Yet, when we look at the COVID situation, I'm waiting for anyone in the mainstream narrative or medical profession to say, hey, let's talk about your immune system. It's like I've never heard that word once. Lifestyle, diet. I mean, just the basics. I mean, I'm, pretty committed biohacker, so I probably take it to a level that many people don't feel the need to because it's just a hobby and a passion. But that's where I go, if where this all leads to is, well, we're close to the vaccine, but guess what? It's probably going to take more than one. And there's never a mention of anything holistic. In fact, the suppression of any information that is not supportive of that narrative that leads to that end of endless forced inoculations, etc. It's hard for me to accept that there are that many people, or perhaps those few people at the top controlling the information and controlling the directions of these systems that aren't just inherently evil. It's just like, it's maddening to me that this information, such as you're presenting, exists in the world, yet here we go in many ways, just kind of like, I'm going to listen to the TV and just do what it tells me. It's astonishing.
It's what we need, though. I think that's somehow the silver lining. And this is where, David Icke and I kind of differ, I guess, is that, is there really a difference between somebody at the CDC with an old paradigm narrative and my consciousness? The word my consciousness is not right. There is no my consciousness. There's only consciousness out there, and consciousness requires a perspective. Like, you can't really have a conscious thought about anything unless you have a perspective from which to view that thing.
Right.
So consciousness only can be manifest in a biologic system, if you will. You have to come out of the vacuum space to develop a biologic perspective, even to be able to have consciousness, because it's just a perspective. What is the consciousness a perspective of is a cooler concept. Well, that's just knowledge, if you will. And so if knowledge is the pool of reality that we really swim in, and yet we're being called into a particle moment. And so we emerge from the vacuum space of singularity, and we come into a quantum moment of a particle state. Every wave can be a wave or a particle. And so as you come into that particle state for, a billionth of a second and another billionth of a second, and every billionth of a second, you and I are updating that biologic, solid particle state to become in agreement with our whole system. This is us. This is who I'm going to be again this billionth of a second. And obviously, when we're adaptive, if we can change every billionth of a second, and then every atom is, deconstructing and reconstructing every billionth of a second, why do we keep manifesting these chronic, declines or chronic disease? Why aren't we always ever present? It's because our consciousness has us limited to this, biologic particle state, and we forget that we have any expanse outside of this particular moment. And so we develop our own story or narrative of who we are and what our limitations are and where we are, where we're going, why we're here, all of this. Yeah, the hospice moment where you're watching a patient die starts to break all of that apart, where you start to realize there is no evilness in the world. Like, I've seen people that anybody would say that was a bad man. He was, alcoholic, strung out on drugs, went through a sexual identity crisis when he was 30. So he got, estranged by his family and his church and rejected by his entire community at that point. All of his substance abuse got worse, went through a couple of broken relationships in his alternative lifestyle environment. And he's going through this journey, and then he's dying of AIDS in my ICU in 2002. Angry, pissed off individual. Like, none of the nurses wanted to be around him. He was just mad at everybody, angry as hell. And he was one of those 3 patients that died that night that we were able to resuscitate, that I've spoken on other podcasts on. I don't think I've ever talked about just like how he was as a human being, but I think it was notable that he was unpleasant to be around. Nobody would have, including his own family or church, could have anything to do with him because he was so toxic. And so when I hear David Icke or anybody else saying, well, there's this cabal and there are these toxic people that just want to kill people, I'm like, okay, I've seen something of that. I've seen something of people that are just toxic. And yet he's one of the guys that, dies that night, and we resuscitate him. He's legally dead for a few minutes while we injecting epinephrine and shocking his chest and doing all this dramatic stuff in the ICU. And he comes back in this like elated state. And he just encountered the other side, and he immediately is nasty again. And he's like, "Why'd you bring me back? What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Come on, dude! I just like freaking saved your life. Like, give me at least half a break here. Like, you're still nasty. I couldn't believe it." And he's like, and then his next sentence, he was the first one that died that night, and then a couple others died that night to kind of replicate the same story, which was what really was one of my big pivot points in my life that night. And he said, I just came back from a space where I was completely accepted. And I just started crying because I felt so deeply convicted that I wasn't accepting that human being on any level the moment before he died. And in fact, I was kind of relieved he died, and I was kind of shocked and dismayed that he came back, until he just explained that on the immediate other side of this particle moment, he was an entity that was completely understood, completely loved, and in a white light state. A few hours later, I have a Baptist minister come back, tell me the same damn thing. And then this kid with this genetic deformity, all this dies, early the next morning, and we resuscitate him. And he's, 18-year-old kid with, horrible genetic condition, all kinds of things against him. And he said the same thing. So by the end of that 24 hours, I had to really start to realize it doesn't matter what background or how nice a guy we are. And the kid was like the center of his high school. Everybody loved him for his resilience. He's just one of these kids who, despite all the cards that were stacked about it, he's still the kindest person, the sweetest person. So there was hundreds of people. Same thing with this minister. Black Baptist minister, Central Virginia, 5 generations of family and church members, they just coming in, pouring into the ICUs. This dude over here, totally isolated, not one visitor, was dying in total loneliness and rejection. Split second later, billionth of a second later, completely accepted in white light, universally there. And so, is there a my consciousness? No, probably not. There's consciousness out there, and at times I'm tapping into it. Certainly, this whole situation with what happened with the death of George Floyd recently is just really a poignant example of, I thought I was a pretty conscious individual, but there was enough that happened in those couple of days and weeks that followed to make me realize I had a perspective on this problem, and it was very limited. I had blinders on, and I thought I wasn't part of a systematic, epidemic of racism that's been around for hundreds of years. I thought we had solved that problem. I literally had kind of checked the box in my male brain of yeah, that's a thing of the past. To have to reorient to oh no, this is a reality right now. And so these events that are unfolding in these recent months are giving us the opportunity to change our understanding of the knowingness, to change our perspective, to change our degree of consciousness towards all things. And if we could have the same compassion for life, i.e. the viruses that are trying so hard to create biodiversity and adaptation to toxic environments, as we would to a George Floyd or his family, or to a young woman shot down by police in her own bed, it's just it's too many tragic stories to really put your head around. And I think one of the most tragic ones is the vilification of biology. We cannot vilify a single bacteria anymore. We have too much science saying there is no such thing as a bad bacteria. It's the population and its completion that makes sure that all bacteria are serving in all of their right roles. In the same way, if we keep vilifying our regulators or the NIH or the CDC or Dr. Fauci, we do just as much harm from this alternative perspective if we're sitting on the same, judgment seat with this vilification, demonizing of, everything that David Icke talks about. And he has a really important role to play. And I really honor him for being a courageous alternative voice out there. But he's, in his messaging, no less, vilifying than Bill Gates or whoever he's gnawing at. It's you guys are literally the two sides of the same coin. So if you're going to sit there and espouse all of this, that you are the only one with the right perspective and you're the only one that knows the truth and everybody else is following a lie, then you're not actually alive right now. Because if you're alive in the particle state right now, you have to acknowledge that the truth is we are living in a toxic stew. And it was created through innovation towards comfort and convenience, not by somebody's, nasty approach to making billions of dollars. We created Microsoft because we wanted the convenience of the computers. We created Monsanto because we didn't want to grow gardens anymore. We got tired of weeding, so we wanted Roundup, and so we all sprayed it in our backyards. We created these multi-billion, trillion-dollar industries by our own desire for convenience and comfort. That's all. And is there human greed and misperception and, back dealing and all? Well, that's all of human history. Of course that's going on. Why would we vilify this chapter worse than the Roman Empire or any other empire that's ever fallen? We simply are watching the fall of another empire. It's hard because it's ours. The American empire is collapsing. And so we can have a lot of emotionality around it. We can have a lot of denial around that. Certainly Germany had a lot of denial at one point about the fall of their own empire, and the military state that rose out of that was symptomatic of control needing more and more extreme measures to keep the common paradigm intact. And no time in my American experience have I seen a more desperate effort to hold on to an old narrative, one that's so limited in its perspective. Like, their goal is like next January. They can't even look past COVID at this point. We've measured some 12,600 viral pandemics since 1976, since we changed our relationship to the virome. 12,600 compared to this one. There's 10 to the 31 viruses in the air, and we've chosen this one. You are part of a narrative, if you're an American right now, that is spending billions, if not trillions of dollars and collapsing trillions of dollars of global economics over your fear of one virus. And there is no public health plan beyond that virus. In fact, we're collapsing all of our previous prevention ideas and food systems ideas just to channel more billions of dollars into this vaccine. That's not going to work. It never has. We've never developed an RNA virus vaccine that worked. That's why they keep backpedaling of like, you know what, one injection is just not going to do it. We already failed that. So we're going to try 2 injections now. And then you're going to need a booster every year. And so they're creating on pretty massive economic machinery there. That's pretty cool if you could require billions of humans to have to subscribe to annual updates of their coronavirus. Coronavirus outbreak in 2002 was not mapped in the same way because we didn't use the scientifically erroneous path of PCR. We instead did it the right way, which was when we would wait for sick people to develop the syndrome, and then we would study them, and we would identify the virus and high viral load in those individuals. And if they went on to die, then we would mark that as a death from SARS. And there was about 9,000 of those cases or so. MERS breaks out, same thing, 8,000, 9,000 patients die in 2012, another coronavirus. Both of those conditions were mapped correctly. This time around, we took the scientifically erroneous model of PCR, which is just an amplification of DNA. It says nothing about how many viruses are in your bloodstream, says nothing about whether that virus is involved in your current syndrome of illness. It just says this virus is present in your environment.
Is it not true that the gentleman that invented the PCR test said that it can't be used to test for viruses?
Not only did he say it verbally, it says it all over the insert package. If you open up a PCR kit, it says this cannot be used for the diagnosis of any disease, or coronavirus. So all PCR is showing that there's DNA or RNA in transcription in the body. And like I said, that's the purpose of viruses. And so when we see a virus spread around the world, which within 6 to 8 weeks of its first appearance, it was all over the world, and it attaches to air particles, travels around the world. It doesn't need human airplanes or human activity to spread. Viruses spread globally all the time in history, long before humans showed up, long before the first airplane. And so this whole chasing airplanes and saying this is case number 1 in the U.S., this is that model is totally broken. That's not how viruses travel. You can spread a virus through respiratory droplet, but that only goes 3 to 6 feet. What the main form of viral transit is aerosolized, not respiratory droplet. And aerosolized happens when you get high jets of air, to pick up a virus and travel with particulate, like carbon particulate in air pollution, for example. And so all of the high death areas that we saw related to the movement of this virus around the world was actually where we saw poisoning of air. So if you have high levels of cyanide and PM2.5, that's where all of the pockets of death really happen. So, certainly Hubei province being the best example of that toxic stew, but then northern Italy, pockets in Germany, London, New York, Louisiana. You go spot to spot, and you're going to guarantee it's going to be high PM2.5, high amounts of glyphosate injury to the soil systems to begin with, but high amounts of carbon particulate and cyanide and other toxins in the atmosphere. So we have vilified this thing. We chased around the planet, and in so doing, we're really chasing health in the end, right? We're chasing this elusive belief that if we could stamp this thing out, we could all be healthy again. When in fact, this thing should be ubiquitous in the environment, is ubiquitous in the environment. And as we saw with SARS, as we saw with MERS, and as we'll see with this thing, it's going to go away from causing any illness. It's still going to be there. So remember, if in 5 years they're still doing PCR saying we're still having new cases it's because they're doing PCR. If we did PCR right now for SARS, or if we do PCR right now for HIV, great study looking at 8,700 healthy individuals in America, Europe, and parts of Asia where they have the lowest HIV rates documented in the world. They took 8,700 patients from those environments and looked by PCR for all of the viruses that were currently present in their bloodstream. 6% of them had HIV. They had already, these were healthy individuals screening negative by blood screening, and they have HIV. Wow. And yet they have no illness, they have no sickness.
And that's because they're showing the RNA from that?
They're expanding the genomic signal from an RNA virus or a DNA virus. It doesn't matter what. The PCR kit is designed to express either one. And so you're amplifying this trace signal of genomics, which are there. There was 6%, I mentioned that, 8,700 had HIV. Only 1% of them had any form of influenza. 6 times influenza was HIV. And so if that study is reflecting the real prevalence of HIV virus in the environment, i.e. the human body, we are some 425 million cases short of HIV in Western civilization, let alone the globe, in the billions. And so, it's just an amazing number that you could start to see, really coming out. Let's see, 425 million, that's for the whole world. So population 7.6 billion, you extrapolate the 6%. Best case scenario, we're at like 425 million cases worldwide. And that's many hundreds of millions more than is currently thought to be existing. So what I'm trying to paint there is this picture of PCR is simply showing you the environment. It shows you what is the genomic mix in the environment. Ultimately, within 2 years, we know we're going to be in balance with that coronavirus. There's not going to be any, new corona deaths. They're going to tell us there are because they can do PCR, and somebody who's dying from some other cause, they can say, see, there's another coronavirus death.
See, this is the part that's pissing me off, is the lack of clarity and the widespread confusion when we're looking at numbers when it comes to COVID-19 or coronavirus, that all of these other deaths being attributed to this vilified virus when there are all these other comorbidities. I mean, we have people literally dying in a motorcycle accident now. And, the ambiguity of that death certificate, I guess, if you could say, or the announcement is that, well, they died with COVID. There's this play on words rather than saying it died of COVID. And so I don't even know where to trust the numbers when you see the waves, the models going up and down in different countries and cities, because it just seems the entire mechanism of testing is faulty. So if you test a wider swath of population using a test that's not even valid or designed for that, you're of course going to get quote unquote more cases, right? When in fact on the ground, how many people are actually exhibiting the respiratory failure and the other symptoms of said pathology?
So the science group that published on this current PCR kit that was produced and distributed worldwide, within the first couple of weeks back in January, February, did the appropriate study, which is to see how many false positives come from this thing. Like when we actually start testing people who are healthy or sick, how many false positives are there? The answer is it had a 19% true positive rate, which meant that 81% of the positive signals were wrong. 19% accurate. On the other side of those people that were confirmed by viral load testing and other mechanisms outside of PCR to see how much virus was there, it missed 30% of those. And so we had one was missing 30% of the right ones and it was overdiagnosing by 80% the ones that didn't have it. And so it's worse than a flip of a coin. Like you can't imagine a worst case scenario for a test. And yet this is what we've now distributed all over the world to say this is how many things. And I'm amazed that I'm pretty used to seeing the WHO and CDC do these kinds of stunts over the last few years. That it's not unusual to see them kind of taking a political agenda and building some science around it. But I've been kind of amazed to see Johns Hopkins, since the very first weeks of this thing, posting on their website exactly how many cases and exactly how many deaths were happening from. I'm like, where are they getting that data from? That's the university has the #1 rated public health school in the world is Johns Hopkins Public Health School, and I applied there. I tried to get in because it was an amazing school, and now I'm looking at that thinking like, who in that school is using a PCR test to pronounce some public health statement on some exact number of cases worldwide? And I don't know who it is. It doesn't make sense. I know it's not any of the PhD statisticians, and they just can't. They know that's not right. There's nobody who's done the math that thinks these numbers are accurate. Is there a coronavirus? At this point in the conversation, it might start to sound like Zach just thinks this whole narrative is fake. Yeah, there's definitely a coronavirus, and I would say we actually know the RNA sequence of that thing. We don't know one portion of it.
Has this particular one that they're calling COVID-19 been isolated in a way that is necessary in order to verify that it does in fact exist in its
I would say yes.
form?
I would say yes. I think it's going to take us 2 more years to really sort that out, because the number of times you need to study that virus over and over again to really validate, because viruses misspell themselves intentionally all the time. And so when we say, here's the RNA signal of this virus, it's going to take, a lot of test cycles before we can be pretty sure, like, this is the consensus RNA, strand of this particular coronavirus. But suffice us to say, we've glimpsed a variant of a coronavirus at the genetic level. It doesn't get identified well by that PCR test because it can amplify almost any coronavirus out there. It has a hard time being specific, to this particular variant. And remember, coronavirus is ever present and causes a significant portion of the common cold. It's not like these every 10-year pandemics. So when we see coronavirus all the time. And so there's an RNA sequence that's been attributed to this new thing. It'll take us a couple of years to really sort out, is that really a new RNA strand, or is it just did we miscategorize it? Who knows? But in hindsight, I don't think there's even going to have the tolerance for anybody listening at that point. So I think at this point, we can say we've either made a scientifically accurate or inaccurate statement that there was a new coronavirus thing, and we went and called it COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 or whatever we're calling it. It's interesting that the regulatory bodies have spent most of their times arguing over what we should call this thing, rather than, what about that human immune system and healthy food and healthy lifestyles, as you said. Literally they're arguing for weeks and months over the most critical phase of a pandemic. They're arguing about what should be called, and so what sounds scary enough, or I don't know what the rationale is, but suffice to say, we used the wrong diagnostic tool to map this thing around the world. All we've done is record the traveling of a virus around the world. That happens all the time. Why are so many Americans dying? Why was there a big, huge peak in all-cause mortality? And that's an important question. And me and a bunch of my colleagues have been really working to understand that, because there was a sudden peak in all-cause mortality if you base it on the numbers where they said our baseline was. But if you look at the CDC numbers as to our baseline of all-cause mortality, every single year during our respiratory seasons, we've been above the baseline, which means we don't have the right baseline. If every year you're in excess of your baseline, something's wrong. And so I don't know if that's an antiquated one that they're using, but suffice to say, whatever we're saying is in excess is not, mapped to our true recent total death, rate. Then you need to adjust death rate to age and population before it becomes a relevant statistic. And they've done none of that. Not once has the news adjusted any of their rates of mortality, all-cause mortality, by age or population. And as soon as you adjust for age and population, suddenly what looks like this huge spike becomes a pretty blunt, increase in all-cause mortality. Then you need to look back more than last year. They keep showing data from last year to this year to show this big spike. If you look over the 7-year trend or the 37-year trend, we've been going like this in the last 7. So a little bit up in the last 30 years, and then really steep. If you adjust for age, it's been pretty much flat, and then it's starting to rise in the last 7 years. So we've had rising all-cause mortality, except for last year. So last year, for whatever variant of reasons, we had a low mortality rate. What happens when less people die last year is they get a year older and are more likely to die this year.
Oh, damn. I never thought of that.
So
that's
all
wild.
of the excess mortality we have right now should be taking into consideration the people that didn't die last year that are now going to die this year because they got lucky last year.
Right.
And so until you start looking over the extrapolation of the trajectory of public health, are you ever going to be able to make any accurate statement or assessment of today's public health? And we keep taking these myopic, blinders on. We don't see the past, we don't see the future, and we're making literally trillion-dollar decisions around that myopic and short-sighted viewpoint, as well as an ignorance to the history. We are going to die. And so does Zach think that nobody's getting sick and dying? No, I just told you we're going to go extinct in 60 years. I think we could all die if we don't radically change what we're doing. But we can radically change what we're doing. because there is one knowingness that we're all emerging from. And we could develop a collective perspective, so that we would call consciousness, to simply change everything that we're doing. And in the last few months, I've become convinced it's going to happen. Honestly, I've been traveling with this information for almost 10 years now, with this, dialogue emerging of like, oh my gosh, as a scientist, as a former chemotherapy producer, I was going down the wrong path, and it's taking me a long time to figure out where is the truth, where is it, and I don't claim to know it yet. All I know is I'm getting funner and funner data because it's taking me deeper into the soil. And if all of my science is taking me back into the soil and saying that if we could get public health rooted here, we would solve everything, I have a very high degree of confidence in that. Do I understand how to do regenerative farming perfectly? No, I don't know any of that. I'm not a farmer, but I'm a scientist that is convinced that if we are rooted in the biologic function of the microbiome, we are extremely resilient. We can repair at an extreme rate. And I get goosebumps over the idea that we're halfway through the sixth extinction. And the amount of viromic information that's happened since just 1976 has never been seen on the planet before. We have the most rich viromic database of biologic adaptation and biodiversification that's ever existed. So if we change in these next couple of years, we're going to get to participate in a great creative, generative future of Mother Earth. We could participate in a rise of life, biodiversity that's never been seen on the planet before. And so while we're busy wringing our hands and yelling at Monsanto and Bayer, if we instead become a solution-based mindset and say we just need to rise above this, and let's let David Icke and and the status quo. I think David Icke's smart enough and has the courage and the prowess to hold the entire U.S. government at bay in a debate. Like, I think he carries that kind of space. So I have a huge respect for him. I have huge respect for anybody who's going to stand up and speak their truth. And if I don't disagree with their truth, which is pretty often, it's irrelevant because they're speaking some element of, from their perspective, towards that knowingness. Their consciousness is speaking towards that thing. And if I try to vilify David Icke or, the Gates Foundation, it's going to slow me down to looking at the bigger, cooler story of what would the bacteria and fungi be doing right now? What are they doing right now? And the answer is they're putting out an enormous amount of information communication and trying to connect more life. They're trying to get connection between biodiversity. So all we need to do is create a society that's doing that. What if I woke up every morning and all of my companies, I set out to organize all my employees into how do we connect to more human beings that are interested in rehearsing a different future? And we're going to start to rehearse that future in our mind's eye first so that we can get a collective consciousness about where we want to go. We want to go into a place where there's no need for 5G radiation towers because we've figured out how to communicate through the fungi. And we have mycelial networks of fiber optic cables that are driving, global technology.
I like it.
We have energy that's now created entirely from the convergence of hydrogen and oxygen into water, which produces an enormous amount of heat. And so we can capture that energy. And that technology is now just around the corner. And we're going to get to see that. And I can't wait to see that expand. So we're going to replace our entire energy sector. We're going to eliminate coal and oil and gas industry over the next 30 to 50 years because this technology is so good at doing what it does, is producing free energy. And so we're going to have such a thing as free energy. We're going to have such a thing as currency that's not based in some financial policy, but based in real human interaction. We're going to change the currency system. And as soon as we change the energy sector and the currency system, all other innovation has got to realign. And as long as that whole economy is backed by soil, not oil, we're going to win the game. Because it turns out that regenerative soil management can grow the asset. We can get more carbon sequestration, we can get more nutrient density, and we can actually build soil through good soil management, whereas an oil-based economy is always going to be short-lived because it's a consumptive, short-term loss. And so the very commodity that was going to back your entire economy, when we pulled off of the gold standard in the 1920s and 30s there, we had to back it with something, and so it became our oil and gas industry. It became our wealth. It became the military machine that was run by that thing, and that was basically what we backed our currency with. And so that's why our nation and our empire, if you will, is collapsing, is because we based it on an entire system that is consumptive and extractive and therefore failing. And now comes along soil science, and we're like, oh my God, if we backed a currency with this. Can you imagine the regenerative thing? So that's what our scientists and engineers are all working on now with our mathematicians and programmers is let's literally design a currency on the way that mycelium work. And if we do that, the fungi are not only going to be our solution, they're going to show us who we really are. If you haven't seen Paul Stamets's work, please, if you're listening to this, stop this and go listen to Paul Stamets, because he's way more interesting than I am. But Paul's work is so profoundly important because it's showing the hyper-intelligence of nature. This thing called quorum sensing in the fungi, when fungi get into a large enough colony, it does hyper-intelligence and can start to do network planning and can distribute resources over great distances. It can realize changes in the bacterial matrix that are needed for that particular tree. Over here, this bush needs this particular matrix of bacteria, so it'll switch the microbiome around, transit new resources in. It's literally functioning as like the most optimized city in the world is just your typical backyard garden. That kind of matrix, when we start building economic systems and impact investment funds and all of that around that design, we can only win the game.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I love the way that you relate it back to the fungi, because I really do believe that particular kingdom are such powerful allies for us in so many different ways.
Consciously, right?
Yeah. For people listening, I don't know that there's necessarily an answer to this, but I know kind of in my squad of people, we're not wearing masks. We're hugging, we're making love, we're living our best life. We're going out in the sun. We're doing ice baths. Our immune systems are strong. We're crushing it. We're eating organic, even regenerative and biodynamic when possible. And, I know I'm speaking of a life of great privilege, but it's not it's been earned, in many ways, put it that way. But the people in my sphere are kind of looking out at the general public going, oh, you poor people, man. The news is brainwashing you into this fear paradigm. But I still don't know exactly, for example, like, does a mask, not even a surgical mask, but like a bandana around your face help at all to stop you from spewing out a virus onto someone else or breathing one in? Is there anything really to be afraid of when we see... I think when this first came out, I was like, oh, it's all a scam. It's fake. That was my first perspective. Because just in my gut, I'm like, this just doesn't feel right. And just all the fake testing and misappropriated deaths and all that. So I'm just like, nah, fake. I'm ignoring the whole thing. But then you have people actually dying. And, everyone knows someone that works in an ICU. And they're like, no, man, there's COVID people and they're dying. And it's kind of confusing when you're on both sides of it. And from your perspective, from what I've gathered and what seems to make the most sense to me is you're talking about like the cumulative effect of a really toxic planet, right? In Wuhan, northern Italy, New York City, et cetera, right? You've got geoengineering sprayed everywhere. You've got glyphosate. You've got, it's not even 5G. Like 5G's been out for a while. There's 4G frequencies that are potentially more dangerous than some of the 5G networks that they're rolling out. It's all the G's, right? It's just radiation sickness. You could just call it that. It seems to me that, okay, there is some version of coronavirus that can be kind of nasty. Some people are getting it. The people that are getting it and dying are people that are likely very toxic from all these other inputs and aren't leading a lifestyle and giving them a robust immune system. So for someone that's kind of more in the mainstream narrative, like, how precautious should one be? And do these masks that we're being forced to wear hold any hope for protecting us or the people around us?
Yeah. So I'm going to try to get this into a nutshell. I'm afraid this is going to be a really long answer.
That's my fault. I know you just tied a really nice bow on this conversation with a message of hope, but I just can't walk away with that.
There's a reality that we have to address here that the narrative is focusing on. So let's go back to how the virus emerged. So the virus comes out of stress. So we knew, years ago that Wuhan was going to be the epicenter of a next pandemic. And when I say we, humanity knew this. Whether we had put the dots together or not, we had all the data in front of us. Because we know through the science that when you stress microbiome or you stress a multicellular organism, it starts to produce viruses, okay? So force genetic, variation and all this. So you can look across the planet and say, well, where's the highest stress level of that? And the pork industry is a good example of this, of like high toxicity, where you've got an enormous amount of antibiotic concentration in their feed through glyphosate and all of that, but also just added to their food to try to abate the amount of invasive infections that they're going to see in that short 1 year, 2 year life that they'll have in that factory farm. And so in that short amount of their life, they're being pressured with all these antibiotics. And it turns out that if you look across the whole world, the highest pork production in the world now is in Wuhan province. So you have that chemical demand. Then if you look across the whole swath of glyphosate production for the feed for these animals, of not just pork, but the biggest one demand is poultry, obviously. But the chemical GMO crops that are being produced to feed these animals, Wuhan, again, is the most dense area in China. But that's not enough to create a pandemic. Now, viruses will spread regionally, but to get them global, you need to bind them with carbon particulate in the air to get them to go really far. And that can be done through organic processes. The CO2 and methane and some of these things can start to bind different elements of viruses, but it's the larger stuff that comes from volcanic activity or solar impact through downstream lightning hitting the ground can liberate carbon particulate into the air, all kinds of natural phenomena. But now what's really happening is we've mobilized the entire oil base to be put into our petroleum industry, and the petroleum is being burned into this small particulate of carbon. And so in areas of high air pollution, you have PM 2.5, particulate matter at 2.5 microns is the specific thing that all governments track. There's a bunch of NGOs that track the particulate PM 2.5. You can go right online, type in PM 2.5 map, and you'll see where it's at highest concentrations. You can actually go to your city and find the PM 2.5 on any given day. They have to track this in real time because it's toxic to humans. So all these environmental protection agencies, both governmental and non-governmental, are tracking PM 2.5. So now you overlap the PM 2.5 map of the whole world, and the hottest spot is typically Beijing, historically, right at the exact moment, relatively low. But historically, Beijing's this huge generator of particulate matter. You can hardly see the skyscrapers, all of that. They're going through great efforts over the last couple of years that I really admire to try and clean up that environment. But nonetheless, it remains very toxic there. That PM 2.5 particulate from Beijing presses down through the northern climate high pressure system coming down from the north and pushes that right onto Hubei province. And so in Hubei, you have the perfect setup for distribution of viral information. And so you have extinction level stress going on at the microbiome of the pork and poultry industry and everything else going on in Hubei. And you have extreme microbial stress coming out of the soils where all that glyphosate production is happening. And in the midst of that, you're killing the soil's ability to reabsorb any of that carbon particulate because it can't breathe. The mycelium have been killed, the fungi have killed, over-tilled, oversprayed, blah, blah, blah. And so now you have the perfect setup for this is a microcosm of our extinction in 60 years. If the whole world looked like Hubei, we'd all be dead some time back. Hubei gets a little bit of grace because there's still an ecosystem on the planet that will absorb this carbon particulate come spring, summer, and into early fall. And so we'll absorb all of that toxicity and down to about 6% of residual or something like that. And then we'll rebuild that whole toxic stew again over our winter months. So that's why we have what we call flu season. Flu's around all the time. It's not like, it suddenly shows up the third week of November every year. But if you look at the CDC maps of respiratory season, it always starts in the third week of November. So what the hell's going on with that? Why the third week of November does the Northern Hemisphere suddenly go into the respiratory virus stage? It's because the virus is around all the time, but between the third week of October and the third week of November, we lose the organic material reabsorption of carbon particulate, and it explodes in the northern hemisphere.
Oh, interesting, because all of the plants lose their leaves, et cetera.
Yes.
Oh, that's wild.
And so that's our flu season is actually solar winter. And so as our soil goes into wintertime and we can't reabsorb CO2 and we're producing too much of it and we start to get higher and higher residuals year after year, we start to become more and more toxic in those winter months. And so the third week in November is where it really goes wild. So these images you can just see on NASA in real time. You can just track a whole year by NASA and see it goes from greens and blues all over the world, a couple little red hot spots around Hubei and Tokyo and New York, Northern Italy being a big one. And then suddenly, between third week of October, suddenly everything starts going oranges, reds. But by March, it's like, you can't even believe it. You can't even see the countries anymore in the outlines. It's just bright red. It's just like carbon junk in the atmosphere. Suddenly, between the second, third week in May and June, it all clears. gone. You can see everything again. It's all greens and blues. And so springtime brings about this regenerative capacity for resilience. So September of last year, that's when we think that this virus probably really got out. The first cases really got recognized by one physician that had been on the front lines of SARS and said, I'm seeing SARS patients. I haven't seen this since SARS. So there's a new virus, coming around. It was the theory. So right at the end of December, this report comes out. And then by January, everybody's starting to scramble thinking, okay, we might have the next thing here. And interestingly, if you're looking at the air pollution between those dates of September, it's showing up, and then suddenly it's starting to become really relevant by the third week of November, with cases not really being recognized for another month in the hospitals. People were dying, but we just said it was flu or whatever. Every year, people are dying. It's like third or fifth cause of death worldwide, depending on what season you're in. And so it's very prevalent. So it took us a while to recognize it, but most likely we're seeing an uptick in respiratory mortality. And again, if you adjust for 7-year trend, population, all these things, the uptick is even now quite minimal. But there was an uptick. And so I'm not here to tell you that nobody's dying of a respiratory failure or a respiratory death. What I'm telling you is it doesn't look like anything that we've seen before in our typical influenza things. And the difference is this looks like a poisoning, not an infection. And so a really nice study coming out of the New York hospitals, 5,700 patients admitted to New York hospitals with coronavirus detectable by PCR. So these are corona cases, and they published of these 5,700 people, what was their presenting symptoms or what was their presenting vital signs, their laboratories, very extensive thing. And their temperature was normal, no fever on the average across those 5,700 people. There was no elevated white blood cell count or what we call left shift, suggesting an infection. There was no signs of bone marrow suppression, no reactivity at the vascular level, showing a high vascular inflammation that you would expect with a virus going on. So by that study, I would say we have no evidence that the people that died of this condition in New York hospitals showed any signs of infection when they showed up. And so instead, what they showed up with was low oxygen and early liver failure. And so when you start to see that combination where you have somebody who's no signs of infection, no fever, and can't carry oxygen, you're starting to get into a category that's not infectious, but it's actually called histotoxic hypoxia. And so histotoxic hypoxia, there's many chemicals that can do this, but the most classic one is cyanide. And cyanide binds to PM2.5 in our air pollution. And so as we start to look at this virus, which it's been shown coronavirus bonds really actively to PM2.5, as most other viruses will, you can imagine this new virus that, different than influenza, tags the ACE2 receptor. And so you have a very specific delivery system into the bloodstream that's going to now bind to blood vessels and deliver anything that it goes into the bloodstream more rapidly than influenza will. And now picture that virus that's supposed to go lung into bloodstream vasculature is now carrying a PM2.5 molecule that's tagged with a bunch of cyanide on the backside of that. And so the virus, most of us are asymptomatic. We see it, we absorb it, nothing, we reproduce it, no problem. Pass it on, no problem. But if we're in an area of high pollution with high cyanide, that virus just caused cyanide poisoning, which presents with no fever, no white blood cell count, no shift, liver failure, and hypoxia. And so we poisoned ourselves with cyanide and 64 other, 120 other toxins. I don't know which ones it is, but we basically poisoned ourselves so that the red blood cell could no longer carry oxygen. And that's the hypoxia part. It's not a respiratory failure that you would see with pneumonia. It's not, the lungs are fine. The problem is that you've poisoned the red blood cell such that it can't carry the oxygen that's being freely absorbed by the lungs as it should. And when you poison the red blood cell such that it can't carry oxygen, you start to get a hypoxic injury. This is just the same with drowning. When you drown somebody, there's a process where, poignantly George Floyd choked to death. And so you've got somebody whose airway is compressed and can't breathe. At the moment of death, there's no fluid in their lungs. There's nothing going on there. But if you resuscitate that individual, George Floyd, let's use that great example. If that knee had been released off of that throat just a few minutes earlier, had not died, 3 days later, he would have presented like a SARS patient, a COVID patient. He would have presented with fluid in the lungs, liver damage, and kidney damage from long-term hypoxia. And subsequent to that, in the days and weeks that will follow, he will start getting micro blood clots throughout his organ system because there's a downstream propensity for blood clots to form after, long-term hypoxic injury. And so what we did basically to the population through a toxicity of our air pollution combined with a virus that was supposed to go where it did, and it did, but it didn't intend to pull cyanide behind it, is we poisoned the entire human population and we saw an uptick of mortality. Why different this year than last year? Is it because of SARS-CoV-2? Is it because COVID-19 showed up? I would say we have absolutely no data to suggest that the uptake in respiratory death and cyanide poisoning and everything else that I'm talking about, histotoxic hypoxia, is because of that virus. We have no data to suggest that because there's something way more obvious that happened between last year's respiratory year and 2019-20 that would have caused this entire syndrome. And it was the Australian fires. And it was the California fires.
Oh, shit.
So we put more carbon material up into the atmosphere over that fire season than we in any time in history, really, at least in recent memory.
Wow.
And so we had to have high mortality this coming year, especially anything related to cardiovascular disease or respiratory failure. We poisoned the atmosphere with more carbon particulate to carry any viruses. We then tracked a virus that happened to be called new. And I know that the science dates back many years to showing that viruses tag PM2.5. I know that very smart scientists are in the government. And so this whole thing of this group of people that got together late last fall and said there's going to be a surprise virus that spreads around the world in these next few months before Trump is out of office, there's going to be this surprise pandemic. They were spot on because I think they were looking at the PM2.5 concentration in the atmosphere. There's going to be an uptick in total mortality and respiratory death this year. And if we could find a new virus to blame that on, we could justify a huge pharmaceutical reconsolidation of wealth.
Damn. Wow. Hot take.
And so I have no idea if it was that intentional and they just got lucky. But it sure suggests that somebody was looking at that data, including last year's low mortality rates, which is an exciting thing because there's going to be high mortality next year, just by natural cause. And so there was this huge opportunity that was very visible in all of the signs. And you have the aging, the baby boomer population very real on this right now too. Why do we have increasing mortality for the last 7 years? Because we have more people over the age of 70 than ever before. Right. And so people are going to be passing away at higher and higher rates over these next few years, even if all things are healthy and well, because they're older. And so we have this perfect storm of an opportunity for a global government to freak the hell out of us because everybody's dying. Well, of course, they had to die this year. We poisoned the atmosphere with more carbon particulate that had higher levels of cyanide in history. Earth Justice, ironically, back in May of 2019, before all of this outbreak pandemic happened, Earth Justice was suing the U.S. government for failure to tell Americans how high cyanide levels were getting in the municipalities that are now COVID centers. And so this was totally predictable, and therefore I think it was predicted. The response to it was monetized. And the pharmaceutical elite are able to do that very well now. And it's very hard for us scientists and clinicians to keep up against them because they don't show us the data.
Right.
If you go on the CDC website to really look at this 7-year data and everything else, it's all antiquated data. It's very hard to really find the data from the last 7 years. They don't show you that. They'll show you normal compared to this year and all this. You can't find 30-year trends, 7-year trends and all that. So they keep you very myopically blinded. So there's a real need for an international scientific community to come together and create our own independent, IT platform that's able to collect real-time public health data from around the world, so that we can start to participate in public health decisions in real time instead of waiting for regulatory bodies to do this retrospectively or make malinformed emergency decisions that aren't based in the real science around it. And so there's been a lack of allocation of funds to do that kind of, technological, integration. It's small amounts of money that are needed, I'm very excited about this fund I'm working on with right now. $100 million could change the whole scope of science. It doesn't take much money when it's well placed. And so we could definitely change the direction of a $3.5 trillion medical industry with $100 million of well-placed research and reallocation of resources. And part of this fund we're working on is developing regenerative organic food system for food banks in COVID-hit areas. The blessing of COVID is it's showing me exactly where the most vulnerable populations are from a terrain standpoint. So
Mm-hmm.
if I can rush in and go create a regenerative revolution in farming at the root causes of problems systemically at the public health level, we're going to win the game really quick. And there's some great success stories going on. This food bank in Irvine is very exciting. They've planted 3,000 square feet, tiny, on their parking lot in the back, a regenerative organic growing system, and that is now helping leverage produce into 500,000 families in LA. And so that little 3,000 square foot footprint is being leveraged brilliantly economically to start bringing in produce from all over the world or all over the country to feed these people. So the metrics are there to show that we're being poisoned by our own behavior. Mm-hmm. We can expect more death. Are people dying right now? Yes. More people than last year? Absolutely. Had to be, because not many people died last year. So we're having a catch-up year. From COVID? Maybe, but it's just one of the many, 10 to the 31 virus that's circulating. We happen to give that one a name and do a bunch of testing on that. But I guarantee you all the viruses are circulating at a higher rate. That's right. That's why even with an erroneous, stupid test that doesn't really work, it's still not accounting for all the total mortality. So where's all that total mortality excess coming in? Well, it's coming from all of the other viruses that are trafficking chemicals into our body inappropriately. And so the viruses, in their effort to get into our genomic apparatus to give us an update, because of our toxic air, is poisoning us. The viruses don't mean to do that. They're not trying to hurt you.
So the viruses are really more the innocent bystander in this equation. That's what it sounds like.
They're totally benevolent. There is no ethic in viruses. Right. There's only integrity of life.
Right.
They literally have integrity rather than ethic.
And if a virus isn't, in fact, I would argue that everything is consciousness from, a more esoteric point of view, but that it's not like a multi-celled or single-celled organism that can be killed and life snuffed out of it. How do like antiviral drugs or ozone, for example? I've always thought of like ozone kills viruses, before I knew that they weren't alive. How does something like that even work for something that's not alive? Does it just interrupt the replication?
Yeah, so it's a package of genetic information carrying a ribosome too. So apparatus for, someone will be able to code for their own apparatus of translation. But as that travels in, if it's too damaged to replicate, then it becomes irrelevant. So sunlight is the best way to do this, right? So sunlight radiation, disrupts the DNA sequences in viruses all the time, so they become relatively irrelevant to us in mass. And so sunlight's a very good sterilizer. So what we should have done at the moment of this, terrifying pandemic, we should have all rushed out naked into the environment and just been immersed. Nobody would have died. It's like, but instead we withdrew away from the sun, we withdrew away from fresh air, and we sequestered. And the more severe we sequestered away, the higher the mortality. And, you can show this in a hospital system or a nursing home, and everybody's like, people are crowded together. No, not actually, because in the massive protests that happened in New York City, just as mortality was decreasing in New York City, we rushed hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of New York in close proximity. Were some of them wearing masks? Sure, but nowhere near enough to say that we were social distancing or protecting anyone. We never answered the mask thing. Need to come back to that.
I haven't forgotten. That'll be the one last question.
We've got this whole mix, and yet mortality in New York keeps going like this throughout all of those protests and everything else. It's not the proximity of people. At this stage, in the first few weeks of the transit of viruses around, human secretions, human secretory droplets and all that, can be a significant contributor to the movement of virus. But now that carbon particulate matter has carried this virus around the world 6 or 7 times now already, all that's going to happen is when we go release us from quarantine, why do the cases go up and why does mortality go up? Well, first, we're probably just tracking that because everybody rushes out to get their test. That's what's happened initially, is like, oh, I need to go back to work. I should see if I've been exposed to COVID. So we all get tested, and we have a test that is 80% wrong. And so a bunch of people come positive that may or may not be positive, but irrelevantly, they're not sick. And then there's some people that do get sick when we go and take people off of quarantine. What's with that? Well, as soon as we go off quarantine, our PM 2.5 levels go right back up because we put traffic back on the road and we do all this stuff, and we get the cyanide poisoning right back. And we know now in Hubei very clearly when PM 2.5 drops below 40 parts per cubic meter, mortality goes away. Goes above that, start to see mortality increase again. And so for Hubei, it seems to be around that. For New York, it seems to be lower. Like we can see that around 12 to 20 parts per per cubic meter. But nonetheless, we have these thresholds, which would suggest that New Yorkers are probably not as healthy as people in China, And so if it takes less PM2.5 to poison us, what does that mean for us? But the reason why we get sicker and start dying more is not because there's more virus. You can't, right now the world's covered in it. Corona's here. You can stop fearing it. It's here. And you've been exposed. And if you've been exposed and you test negative, does that mean you don't have the virus? No, it just means that you figured out a homeostasis with that genomic update and you never had to replicate it. You saw no need for that replication, or you already absorbed that into the matrix of the intelligence of your genome, and you're not making that protein that would come from that virus or whatnot. So you've come into balance as a humanity. Again, we only have about 8 or 9 more months and all of humanity will be balanced. And in that short period of time, they're going to rush out with a vaccine, throw this vaccine in the market. It's going to be a piece of crap. And they're going to see, it fixed everything. It went away.
Right.
That's why they have to rush it to market, is because this thing's going to be away if they wait through next summer. So they have to get something out by next January to make it appear like it helps.
It's kind of like the models you see of polio, right? Where polio is, at this steady level, and then it starts to tank when, I don't know, whenever it was, the timeline.
1960s,
Yeah, and then it flatlines, and then a decade later, the vaccine comes from it, and you're like, what happened then? Oh, refrigeration, sanitation,
Well, I mean, there's 2 major things that happened with polio. This goes down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but quickly, we keep attributing things to the vaccine, but what was happening it's important to remember that we'd never had endemic, severe problems with polio until the 1940s. And so polio has been ever present around the world since the beginning of mankind and long before. And yet it's only got little pockets where it seems to show up in endemic kind of areas where it's kind of always there, smoldering along. And there's polio in parts of India and all of this. And you can travel the world and see, oh my gosh, look at that person with polio. We never see that in the United States. Well, in the 1940s in the United States, we suddenly saw a ton of polio. And hospitals had to be emergently built because we were seeing so much polio. And so the Colorado health system where I trained with my medical degree was actually built as a sanatorium for patients with polio and all of this. There was initial ones built for TB back in the late 1800s, but then polio really necessitated all these places to be built with all these iron lungs. We had all these children paralyzed; they couldn't breathe, so we put them in iron lungs to breathe for them. Today, you see no polio in the United States, or by the 1970s. So what happened between 1945 and 1970 to create this huge epidemic? Nobody pays attention to that. They just say that somehow a vaccine made it go away. Well, was it a lack of vaccine that made it happen in the population? No, it was a change in the terrain. And the main thing that happened in the 1940s when that started to really go crazy is a middle class was born out of World War II. And so with the rise of middle class, we suddenly had swimming pools all over the place. And these swimming pools, were natives for polio. And so we saw it was scary for moms to take their kids to the swimming holes every week because somebody was going to get polio and they never knew if it was their kid or not. And so it felt like this crapshoot. So there's huge fear of polio. There's all this stuff. Between that 1940s and the 1960s, we start to understand chlorination of pools and we start to chemicalize our pools and we clean up that swimming environment as children. And suddenly polio starts going away.
Whoa.
So we changed the terrain that they were swimming in, but we also changed the terrain of their immune system because in the 1940s, coming out of World War II, we had really developed a lot of technology around X-ray during World War II. And so we started using X-ray radiation to knock out the tonsils of children that had tonsillitis. And so we would irradiate their tonsils, which happened to be the very immune system that would bring you into balance with a respiratory virus or a waterborne virus as it is. And so we started to irradiate the upper, or we were surgically removing those tonsils. So we were either burning them out or we were cutting them out at the same time that we were creating these, pools of unhealthy microbiome unbalanced. And so we went into this abnormal relationship with polio, saw this explosion of polio. By the 1960s, we realized that kids probably should have their tonsils and we shouldn't universally remove those and all of this. And so we stopped that practice towards the late 60s or so. And then, by that time you see eradication of polio already happening and the vaccine it came out earlier than that. It took years before we reached that, herd immunity levels and everything else that was supposed to eradicate. So long before we had anything like herd immunity, if that was really the right model, we had to contain this, into a very rare condition in the United States, which remains today. And so that if the polio vaccine worked, then the Gates Foundation would have stamped it out of northern India already, where they've been spending billions of dollars, pouring in India to eradicate this polio virus. When in fact, they're playing on this two-dimensional chessboard, thinking it's the immune system versus polio. It's the immune system versus polio. We got to kill the polio. So we got to give the immune system a stimulus with this vaccine to make the polio go away. And so they go and rush people over here because there's a hot spot. Then the next year it pops back up over here and they're chasing it around. And if you've watched Bill's brain you can see Bill like going like this, like whack-a-mole. He's like, we got polio over here, we got polio over here. And he's showing Warren Buffett and he's like, we're stamping this out. And I'm sitting there, looking at that as I don't know. I don't even know what I am. I don't know if I'm a doctor or scientist or I don't know what I am, but just as an observer and just imagining a three-dimensional chessboard being handed to Bill Gates and being like, no, there's a terrain here. He would figure it out in a split second. But the people that are asking for all of his money keep handing him this two-dimensional board. Mm-hmm. So is Bill Gates the demon behind all this? No, he's a consummate problem solver, I think. You can see him working so hard on this problem. Thinks he's going to solve this thing because he can outthink it. But again, he's playing on this two-dimensional chessboard that they keep handing him, saying, oh, we got to spend more money over here. Okay, here's another $1 billion. Pharmaceutical companies are never going to tell them that there's a three-dimensional train model there because they are not going to get paid. And so is it Gates' fault? No, it's the whole system is built on this old narrative to exploit it for the trillions of dollars industry it is. Mm-hmm. U.S. healthcare alone, $3.7 trillion. That's kind of like saying 10 to the 31. But who knows what $3.7 trillion looks like? But it's pretty awesome that over the next 30 years that we'll expect to spend on chronic disease management in the United States $150 trillion. What could the world do over 30 years with $150 trillion? What kind of innovations could we do? And so when we start, talking about things like defund the police, defund this or that, if we're going to start reallocating resources, let's start with the healthcare system because nothing is more wasteful than this healthcare system when it comes to dollars poorly allocated on old science, old perspective. If we're going to change the world, we could do it so easily with $150 trillion. I think we can change the world with $1 trillion. I think it's pennies on the dollars to implement solutions rather than chasing the old narrative and trying to do more and more damage control over collapsing biology. Health is so cheap. And anybody who's ever done this knows this. I was spending all this money at the doctor and I was depressed and I was on meds and I was always inflamed. I couldn't work, so I was not productive. Then I changed my lifestyle and I got healthy and I got a great job and I'm making money. I don't spend anything on my health but for good food. And it's so cheap to be healthy. It's so expensive to be sick and disconnected from a mother nature. And chronic disease is killing our entire economy. It's certainly taking our empire to its knees. And I'm okay for that collapse, but let's make sure that whatever we rebuild out of this empire, let's not let it be another empire built on the same metrics. And I think if we allow that, I'm sorry to keep using David Icke, but you brought him on earlier, but if we allow that narrative between David Icke and the Gates Foundation to continue to dominate our view and all of our energies put in, which side do I believe? Oh my gosh, wringing of hands. Is there really a cabal? Are they playing? Or is this all well-meaning public health people? The answer is yes, both, of course. There's truth in both of those sides. There's very well-meaning people at the Gates Foundation that I've had joy of working or meeting with or whatever. There's really great people that are speaking truth from the alternative perspective. David Icke's probably one of them. And so there's just genius and brilliance and ultimately some altruism in, I think, everybody. And if we keep fighting that out, and the vaccines are a great example. I'm not anti-vaccine. Instead, if you go to my website, you can sign a petition, change.org, to change our scientific definition of child health and immunity and our approach to vaccination. So we don't need to argue pro or against it. We simply need to allow the science of the last 30 years to update our current public health policy and our R&D on vaccines. Vaccines should no longer be implemented in the population until we understand the downstream consequences of that vaccine in a human experience. We know from military studies that the influenza vaccine increases your risk of deaths from coronavirus the following 2 years. And so if we had known that, which we did, that was 2017, what you should have heard at the beginning of this December pandemic of a new coronavirus was, oh my gosh, nobody should get influenza this year. Please freeze the influenza vaccine policy and please take everybody off of your ACE inhibitors and your statin drugs over the next 5 months because those are upregulating your absorption of this virus. And so we could have easily just stopped 2 drugs and not vaccinating. We would have seen decreased prevalence of corona in the species. Would have that changed our mortality? No, not at all. We would have just not had a narrative of vaccine and we would have seen this increase in mortality, because we poisoned the atmosphere more than we ever have before, and we had low mortality last year, so we were going to have a catch-up year on top of a very toxic year. And the good news is next year I think we're going to have a decent year, and there's going to be very little 2020, 2021 coronavirus. There'll be some influenza, but it's not going to be one of our big, huge spikes because we've absorbed that. Now in the United States, you're going to see a spike because we're going to test like hell, and it's going to look like there's a ton going on. But look at the global data at that point. For all of us, we just need to focus on the global dialogue. And you can look across the whole world, and everybody else has settled down now. From Iran to Pakistan to all over the world, numbers are settling down. And there's going to be hot spots for sure because you can track it. As soon as you put tests anywhere now, you're going to start measuring corona. So you can create the appearance of a hot spot anywhere in the world now if you put tests there. But mortality is settled down. Mortality globally is settled back into our seasonal appropriate levels, which is going to take us through to November. Then we're going to see a seasonally appropriate uptick. But it's going to be, I think, less than it was this year because we had a good catch-up year. But the trend will be upward still. So if they say it's still above baseline, remember their baseline isn't even right. Their baseline is lower than any of the last 7 years on record. They need to recalibrate their baseline before they tell you if all-cause mortality is on track or not. And so there's a journey, and I don't feel that heavy about it because I know it's going to be over soon. Next summer is like a blink in time. These years tick by so quick. And so while I might completely lose my mind and go crazy over masks for another year, there's a chance that I'll make it through that with some psyche intact and want to keep trying to win this game for myself and for humanity and the rest. But in the end, we shouldn't be very dramatic about it because, my God, my grandparents, your grandparents went through World War II. And whenever I start to get dismayed, I go home, I shut the door, and I watch a World War II documentary, or I watch a World War I documentary. We have been annihilating human life face-to-face with machine guns since the beginning of time. If we now do it indirectly to maximize wealth through vaccines and everything else, shame on us, but is it any different? And the answer is, I think it is different because nobody's tolerating sending our young men into machine gun fire at the numbers that we did in World War I or World War II. So consciousness is changing. We don't tolerate that kind of brutality anymore. We're saying as a people across the world, that's not right. It's not right for children warriors to, children be on battlefields. Mm-hmm. What's an 18-year-old compared to a 14-year-old in Africa? Like, is that really, since we send all of our 18-year-olds into war, is that any different? Is that really a higher ethic? Is that not child warfare, And the answer is no. Of course, that's child warfare. We've been doing it since the beginning of time, but less so recently, where we're starting to be like, that's just not right. We need diplomacy. And so I think there's a consciousness rising. There's integrity rising where our ethics still lag behind. There's integrity rising. And that integrity reflects, hopefully, a plugging into consciousness. And if that's happening right now, it's only because the viruses are helping us adapt faster.
Dude, powerful stuff. I got two last questions for you. One is there any sense in wearing a bandana around your face to try to stop a virus?
So maybe in the first few weeks of if there's new genetic information and you're sick and you can't tolerate genetic updates, so it would have to be that global. But if you had all the risk factors and all of that, then stopping respiratory droplets in those first couple of weeks of a new viral spread around the world would make some sense in that you'd have less respiratory droplets. There's no evidence that a bandana does that, but a mask, you could argue, okay, maybe that does it. So there's some rationale to it. But does it work is a whole different thing that we really lack the science for. The science has been done with the N95 mask, which is the gold standard. So now we went from porous bandana that probably does nothing to what we call the flu mask in hospitals. So if you have a patient with influenza, you have to wear one of these masks to enter the room. The N95 respirator is, designed to push all of the air through the mesh-blown plastic rather than allowing any escape around the face, So you've got your N95 respirator. It fits really well. You actually have to get fitted for your size and all of that to be properly fitted for an influenza mask. So you got your N95 respirator mask on, and they put this on coronavirus patients who are actively replicating the virus, show up sick, classic histotoxic hypoxia, they're blue, they're dying in the ICU, put a mask on them. And then after 6 hours of wearing that mask, they then swab the whole inside of the mask to find all of the coronavirus. And there's none. They can do PCR all day long. They can't find any virus there. They swab the outside of that mask, and there's coronavirus all over the place. How is that possible? What's happening, and this has not been teased out in the literature well, but this is just going back to like aeronautics engineering, is that if you go from a low pressure system into a high pressure event, you're gonna pull material off of particulate matter. And so with that high speed of airflow, you can pull virus, for example, off of PM 2.5. And so you've got a mask that's sitting over the face of somebody who's producing virus, sending it out into the atmosphere, and it can bind any particulate matter, including respiratory droplets. It's coming out of my mouth at a very low pressure. It's less than a couple of pounds of mercury. So low respiratory exhale. As soon as it hits that 1 millimeter thickness of the mask, it has to channel all of that air volume through nano-sized air channels, which means that for just a millimeter of distance, we're going to be in a very high velocity state to get through that mask. On the immediate other side of that millimeter, there's going to be a low pressure system again, and you're going to get this huge eddy on the other side. And so the mask is well engineered to push virus out into the environment in an aerosolized fashion. And so you're not going to get respiratory droplets. You're not going to get the droplets right around that 3 feet, but you just took aerosolized virus out in the environment as a distinct likelihood. And so they've found and published, out of Italy and China that they were finding that there was aerosolized virus in the air vents of hospital rooms that had COVID patients in them, suggesting these patients were capable of going from respiratory droplet into aerosolized production in the hospital room, all of them wearing masks. So from my standpoint, we don't know yet if they help or not. It doesn't make sense that they would, because they can't stop viruses. Penetrating viruses are smaller than those air passages are. So we can take them through. We've shown that they go through because you can swab it right on the outside of the mask and not on the inside of the mask.
Would the equivalent size-wise be something like throwing a baseball through a hula hoop? Like, what kind of size difference are we talking with a surgical mask and the actual size of a
the actual
virus?
size of the virus is tiny. So so there'd be something like that scenario there. But the reason why they think it would stop is because, again, they explain that it's tagged to a respiratory droplet.
Got it.
And so the respiratory droplet's relatively large and should snag within the and you can feel this when you breathe in a mask. There's all this humidity that develops inside that mask. It's supposed to be trapping that respiratory droplet in there. But if you have that high pressure system that's now able to strip virus out of those respiratory particles, it doesn't matter how much humidity is absorbed or how much humidity is sitting inside your mask. If you can strip that of all the virus, which is what the study is showing, there's no virus on the inside of the mask, then it suggests that it's aerosolizing on the other side of that.
Wow.
And so now that we're, again, months and months or a year into this, pandemic, it becomes irrational to be outside with a mask on because outside is virus. That virus is blanketed the place. What makes some sense is that if you have somebody who's sick right now, that you do your proper distancing just to adjust your volume of virus if you're really concerned. But remember, a good example of this happened in my family recently. One of my members of my distant family shows up with positive, and she's PCR positive in like blood, antibodies positive, like everything's positive. So I think that's probably true positive. And nobody tests positive, nobody gets sick, and she's not sick either. And so with nobody sick, we see a virus becoming positive in an individual. That's happening all over the world. It's irrelevant to that person. It's irrelevant to anybody else. And so it's an interesting journey now to realize that we have the ability to continue to vilify this thing and make a really long narrative out of this that could last many years, saying that we can still find people with PCR evidence of this virus in the environment. Or we can acknowledge that in the first few weeks, we could slightly slow the progress of this thing down through change of respiratory droplet. So maybe that's possible. That theory still should remain on the table. I'm not going to reject that because I don't have enough science to prove that that's wrong. But once we've moved past a few weeks and we're 6, 8, 10 weeks in, we know that this virus is ubiquitous and we need to stop wearing masks as soon as possible because if anything, we're just aerosolizing, not just this virus, but we're aerosolizing viruses, period. Right. So if we really have fear of viruses, we should stop wearing masks, I think. But do I think this is really making public health worse? No, I don't. I think that it's probably hurting. We know that it decreases oxygen levels, and especially elders over the age of 55, you put a mask on, your O2 levels will drop over the next 2 hours. None of that's good. Is it really going to increase mortality? I don't know. Nobody knows. But we're putting these masks on, And where I've had to settle out is we've gotten into this situation through an irrational process. There's no science that backed up to get us to this point. So I have to every day surrender the possibility that we're going to have a rational resolution of this problem. You can't have a rational resolution of an irrational problem. You can't. It just doesn't equate. You're never going to find it. Right. And so we just have to let the irrational response of a vaccine and masks happen. And then during that time, instead of like banging our heads against that, we should probably get together as humanity and say, what world would we rather live in? One that we're going to be masked and social distance and not allowed to gather in groups and afraid of hugs and afraid of our loved ones, connecting with our loved ones through Zoom calls instead of being at their bedside when they're dying. What humanity do we want? What are we going to do together? What are we going to visualize together? What does the hospital of the future look like? What does the clinic of the future look like? What does the schoolyard look like in the future? It should not look like any of those look today, because those are all part of an old paradigm of militarized belief that we need to battle and kill everything out there. We don't need to kill everything out there. We need to welcome this stuff in. And when my family members get COVID positive, I'm going to get really excited knowing that we've gotten a genetic update. I'm not going to fear that thing. And I'm going to recognize that, wow, there was this big stressor that happened on the planet that induced coronavirus again, like it does every 10 years, to transform again and shift again. What is coronavirus trying to teach us? I don't know entirely, but it's something about the overall stress level of the planet, trying to find loopholes for life beyond. So if you come in contact with somebody with corona, thank them and ask for your body to intelligently take that update. There's an interesting study that showed that if you get more than 7 hugs a day, your risk of influenza the following year is 35% less. It's not social distancing that protects us from viruses. It's biologic communication. It's more microbiome diversity. Every hug brings us in connection through many things outside of the microbiome. We have genetics that we swap every time we hug. And so the hug that I got from you when I walked in, I got a whole epigenetic update from you as to what level of stress or peace do you have in your body today. And I get that update. And I can bet that it was a pretty good, peaceful state that I got because I felt better as soon as I got that hug. Mm-hmm. I'm not getting enough hugs these days. And so as soon as I got that, I felt an energy shift in myself. We've had this awesome dialogue for a couple hours and it just unfolds. That's what life is supposed to feel like. And that's the world we want to live in. Is it going to include masks? No, that's not. Nobody wants to live in a world of masks, ultimately. But we did that to ourselves. We got to ourselves to a point as a humanity that we masked ourselves up and covered our faces, covered our identities, lost our identities on some level in that process. And so we just need to wake up to that. And we don't need to argue over masks working or not. We don't know what they do. It looks pretty bad right now as far as the science goes. But maybe by some miracle, I'm totally missing the whole thing and I don't know the science, and all that's very likely. And I always get a lot of flashback from all of these, podcasts that I do of like, well, he's ignoring this data on HIV or this like that. Well, first of all, there's no way in a 2-hour conversation that we're going to able to annul 150 years of dialogue of germ theory. It's impossible. So I'm always amazed by the expectations of the audience. Like, well, you didn't consider this data. Well, actually, I've considered, infinitely more data than I've shared today. But in the end, we're just in a human dialogue, and there is no amount of science that makes any of this relevant. Now makes it all relevant. It's the whole thing that makes it relevant. Humanity's in crisis. And I don't care if you look at socioeconomics or health or anything, we're in crisis as a humanity. We're in crisis as a planet. And if we continue to ignore that, we'll go into our hospice moment. And in hospice, we get reborn. And I've never seen a patient on hospice that doesn't show those incredible signs of reincarnation, even in the body, where they're suddenly realizing that the narrative they've been living by, the story they've been telling themselves of their identity and their failures was all wrong. And in fact, they've been successful their whole life because they did have 2 amazing kids, or they did touch, some elders that they took care of throughout their lifetime. And they did these amazing things, and they suddenly see their life through this spectrum of beauty. And they stop stressing about their life, and they reconcile with long, estranged family members, and they do all kinds of beauty in those last few breaths of life. And obviously, it's just like a couple sentences of just, I love you so much, and I'm so sorry that I couldn't communicate that to you more. Done. 30 years of estranged, bitter relationships, fixed. Wow. It takes just a couple of words at the bedside to totally change it, because the veil is so thin at that point. That person is so expanded energetically that if you'll come into the space of somebody who's dying and just share a moment, share a breath, let alone a voice or a word, and you're getting to experience that human being at a volume, at an energetic level that you've never touched that person with. They're expanding right now as they let go of that particle moment and go back into waveform, that you have an opportunity to touch something you've never touched in that human being. And when this virus scared the hell out of all of us, we isolated people away. They died in isolation in ICUs, untouched. For the first time in my medical experience, I've never seen anything scare doctors and nurses out of rooms before. They're always at the bedside when somebody's dying. Not with this one. We scared them so bad that they were too afraid to go in the room because we had to convince them that this was, an all-cause mortality event. This was going to kill people if they went in there. And so that's the humanitarian sadness that I have, is we had an opportunity to really rise consciousness by touching the people that were expanding in this year of mortality. This was a year of mortality. Was it a pandemic? No, it was a year of mortality, as far as I'm concerned. We had a catch-up year to have anyways, and we're on our way to a total extinction if we keep this going. It's a year of mortality. We have many years of mortality ahead of us. If we will touch the people that are dying, we will learn so fast, and we will change our behavior so much quicker. If we continue to sterilize death away from the human experience, we will die miserably and we will die lonely. And so we have an opportunity to reconnect and do what the fungi do all the time, which is at the moment of death, they create a life event out of that. As a tree falls, life explodes. A single tree within weeks can have 100,000 different species on it. That's biodiversity. That's what the fungi want to do. And so as you get planted back into the ground at the end of your life, the fungi will make sure you become more biodiverse and that you create life more abundant than yourself at the biologic level. And meanwhile, on the energetic level, you will have expanded and you will have passed on your experience into the cosmos, into the consciousness, into the knowingness beyond.
Wow, dude. Incredible. I love your fractal observation of the universe and us. It's incredible how everything in the microcosm is just sort of replicated all the way up the line. It's just absolutely fascinating to talk to you. I know both of us have been sitting here on these poofs for a while, and my back's killing me. I'm like, but wait, I have 6 more questions. But I think it's a good place to wrap that up in a really hopeful part. I want to ask you just one last question about the glyphosate issue, because I don't do well with gluten, but sometimes I have a moment of weakness. Like last night, I had a beautiful, steak salad at the hotel over here, and it had some sourdough bread chunks in there. I thought, don't do it, Luke, don't do it. But it tastes so good. And then while I'm eating, I go, Luke, this is probably not organic flour, and it's probably full of glyphosate. Would you say in your glyphosate experience that if you're eating any type of gluten that it's not bona fide organic, that it's guaranteed to be sprayed with glyphosate in most cases?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to have residual of glyphosate in there. Wheat grown in northern climates is almost always sprayed to desiccate it. So it's not just sprayed for weed killer. It's actually sprayed right at the end of its life to make it dry out faster. And we do that with soybeans. We do that with chickpeas. There's a lot of legumes that we spray in addition to wheat right at the end of their life cycle so that we can accelerate the harvest. And so we can harvest them out of the fields faster. So we spray them 3 days before harvest. So any of those northern crops that are being sprayed like that are going to have very high residuals. And it's ironic in there, but EWG is a good source to look at this. The Environmental Working Group website, you can go there and you can see glyphosate residues reported in kind of your dirty dozen, they call them, as the ones you never want to buy unless they're organic, or the clean 15, which it doesn't matter if they're organic or conventionally grown, they're going to have trace residuals. And so EWG is good, but there's always some surprises when you see these studies, like Stacy's pita chips. I'm going to get hate mail this week from Stacy's, but Stacy's naked pita chips, it sounds so healthy compared to the Fritos sitting next to it. And yet it has almost 100-fold more glyphosate than the Fritos have. And so it can be surprising how much wheat can carry because the corn's not desiccated. And so the corn in the Frito, while some of it's probably GMO and it's no better done, it's not at all good for the planet. the Frito, because it's corn, not wheat, is going to have, the potential to have far less glyphosate present in it. So it can surprise you which foods have it. And this, comes into the fruit and vegetable world, which is how I found my way into all this science. Anyways, I started a plant-based clinic and was feeding people a ton of kale and beets and turnips and all this. And it turns out that, there was a third of these patients that were doing worse, not better on these health foods. And these are people in a food desert in Virginia, like 5th generation poverty. This can't be real. So I just thought they were lying about what they were eating for 2 years. And finally I developed enough relationship where I realized these people, not only did I trust them, they were just some of the most beautiful people that I'd ever met. And I knew by 2 years in that they were eating healthier than I was. And yet they were having increased inflammation and diabetes and everything getting worse on what I thought was health food. And then you start to look at the residual chemicals in kale and beets and turnips and radishes, and they're among the highest in the food system. And so I didn't know to tell them to eat organic at the time. And we were in an impoverished area, and pennies count when you've got, a family living on food stamps. So I wasn't about to go say they couldn't shop at Whole Foods, not an option. But I didn't realize how badly we were poisoning them through this food system there. So you started by saying somewhere in the beginning how privileged we are to pursue a healthy lifestyle. And this was actually predicted by Benjamin Rush at the beginning of our country. He was one of the signers of the Constitution. And he said something amazing to Thomas Jefferson back in the day. He said that we must put health freedom in the Constitution. We must reserve free rights and access to health care and otherwise, because if not, in some time in the distant future, there will be a bourgeoisie kind of wealthy sector that will rise up and control health and take it on for their own good and use it as a weapon against the masses. That was 200 years ago. That was predicted. Damn. And so Benjamin Rush, in his effort to protect us in the Constitution, saw the likelihood that if we made health and access to health an expensive commodity, we could control money on a scale, and we can control political power on a scale never seen before. And he predicted that. And I think that's exactly what's happening today, is we have a very small sector of people that have come to own health, and they parse it out to the highest bidder. And those of us with affluence are spending more and more money every year to sequester those resources for our families, and leaving food deserts all around us as we sequester that. And so when we say that there's 1% of wealth or 99% of wealth and 1% or whatever we're moving towards there, the same thing is happening in nutrient density. We're channeling the nutrient density into fewer and fewer people at the cost of starvation of the rest of the world. And that's why we need a revolution at the farm level. And until we do an agricultural revolution, we're not going to see justice. And so in all of our work, as we work with soil compounds and put them into expensive supplements, because it costs all of our money to make these things, and we're selling supplements to the 1%, we're taking all of those funds and trafficking them back towards these root cause, solutions that we see in farming, energy sector, monetary systems, and trying to reinvent the foundation. Because if we just go out and I pay myself millions of dollars because the supplement is selling, I'm just part of the problem. No matter how good that supplement is, it's going to kill the planet if I'm not channeling those resources back into soil so that we can have a new soil-based economy. So that's the kind of business mind that we need to start to all adopt, is if I am not part of the fundamental solution to soil, water, and air, and that's not my top line of my companies, then I'm part of the problem. 1% for the planet BS is done. That didn't work. Turns out you're going to have to do a little more than 1% of your effort and profits towards the planet. Yeah. She needs 99%. She can tolerate probably 6% abuse, but we need a good 94% for her. And so we need to just rewrite the top line of companies for soil, water, and air, meaning every dollar that comes in profit, you need to be reinvesting it towards innovation and support to these three ecosystems. And if that's the model that consumers are made aware of, then they can choose who they're going to buy from, and we can change the whole CPG, consumer product.
Wow, crazy! And this is what you're doing with the Ion Biome product.
Yeah,
there's one behind us on the shelf. If your camera's pointed at it, it's over there. I know you're not like a cheesy sales guy. Like, I've heard you interviewed a bunch of times. You've never even talked about your company or product, but maybe just as we come to a close, give a plug for that, as it's helping a lot of people, myself included. I take it every day. I give it to my dog every day.
Yeah, so the Ion came out of the microbiome studies. So we were trying to figure out why those 1/3 of our patients were getting sick, and we started studying plant and soil constituencies, like how many nutrients were in there. It turns out that we're devoid of all of our nutrients, mentioned the amino acids and all that earlier. We're deleting the medicine out of our food at the same rate we're deleting the amino acids out with glyphosate. And so glyphosate eliminated. Food was our medicine until 1976, basically. And then ever since, we've been taking the medicine out of our food. And so we deleted that. And so as we studied that, we found in the soil a molecule that looked a lot like the chemotherapy medication I used to make. And in that journey of coming to understand the potential for these carbon molecules made by bacteria and fungi, it became clear that they could be a method for communication at the cellular level. And so my area of expertise in chemo was around redox signaling, which is the communication at the molecular level. And it's basically the transit of electrons. So you can imagine like a liquid circuit board moving electrons across a digital matrix, And so in the biologic field, it turns out it's the microbiome that builds this communication network between the human cells. And so by putting this stuff back into human cells, by getting the carbon molecules out of fossil soil, we were able to get oxygen and hydrogen to bind to it again, which allowed it to traffic electrons. So we basically just rebuilt the biochemistry of a good, healthy gut. A big, diverse microbiome of the gut or soils should always be doing this. But in a world of glyphosate, antibiotics, and everything else, nobody has a healthy gut anymore. So we're basically just giving a Band-Aid basically back from the microbiome. And the cool thing is it doesn't do anything to you. It's the only supplement on the market that intends to do nothing on and of itself. It doesn't try to upregulate anything. It doesn't hit any receptors. It's not like vitamin D that changes 2,000 genes in your body. It just is the communication network between the cells. And it turns out that when a cell can talk to another cell, it knows exactly what it needs. So this is basically rebuilds the mycelial network of communication between the cells. And it's cool that it's made by the mycelium and the bacteria and everything else. And so the microbiome produces this, and so it's just the communication network pouring back into your body. And then we get to see what you can do. And for some people, it's really cool. You get to see this explosion of health. And this, for other people who are quite healthy, you've now just reinforced your network. You've reinforced yourself. You've made yourself more resilient. And of course, we see, a massive explosion of, the microbiome's, interface with the immune system, and it's beautiful to see the immune system come back on. And the immune system isn't a thing. So when I say the immune system is coming on, it means that there's now a relationship building happening between the outside world and your inside world. And we now know that the body's not supposed to sterilize itself. And, we don't make antibodies to kill bacteria. We make antibodies to bring ourselves into balance with bacteria and the right bacteria per organ system. So we bring an intelligent, relationship back into the ecosystem as we put the communication network back in. And so the product is very exciting because it's basically giving us back a foothold of where we were maybe back, a few hundred years ago or maybe a few thousand years ago, because we've actually been destroying our soils since the beginning of agriculture a long time back. And we've only accelerated in the last 30, 50 years. But really, it's been millions of years since we've seen the biodiversity that this compound is demonstrating. So we're pulling this out of soils that are 60 million years old. And so when you go back to that kind of intelligence of the planet, that was before the last extinction event, that soil then has never been replicated again. And so we're going back in time to say, what is the most diverse, fungal bed and, soil intelligence look like? And then we're putting that into the human system for the first time, which is kind of goosebumpy moment every time somebody grabs one of those bottles for me to think there's a human being, that's a Homo sapien, 200,000 years of Homo sapiens about to touch soil that was 60 million years old. I wonder what's going to happen. And so we've seen this thing do some extraordinary things in children, and the conditions that all these people report improving, again, have nothing to do with the compound. The compound doesn't fix autism or cancer or, heart disease or mood disorders or depression. It doesn't fix anything, literally. It's that humans are able to heal. Mm-hmm. And if they have enough access to information, and if the communication network is up, they're going to start to heal. How fast they heal depends on their age, their hydration level, their toxicity level, like so many variables. Mm-hmm. And so when you get the communication network back on, you're never sure what's going to happen. You're going to start detoxing and feel worse for a couple of days. You're going to feel better. Like you just don't know. And so we like easing people in. There's no rush. Humanity's never seen these molecules at this level of intelligence and capacity. And so what's the rush? This has never been here before. It's not like you lost it 2 years ago. You're welcoming in ancient intelligence of planet Earth. And so that's why the product's now called ION, which is an acronym for the intelligence of nature.
Oh, cool.
You're welcoming in the intelligence of nature into your body, and you're going to see what you do with that intelligence. And it's going to depend on your perspective, your consciousness, if you will. And it's going to shift you in some direction or not. And so it's an interesting thing for something that's so innate or so inert, not really doing anything in and of itself. It does so much. And for some people, they're like, oh, I tried that. I felt terrible for a couple of days. Well, that's weird. When you take vitamin C, you don't feel terrible. Take vitamin D, you don't feel terrible. Why did you feel terrible for a couple of days? And something was happening in your body. What was happening there is the immune system as it come back on, and as cellular metabolism picks up, what's that going to feel like? Are you going to feel fatigue because the accelerator pedal just went down on the gas? So you ease yourself back into this. And so just a couple drops of ancient soil is changing the way that we think about human biology, because we've always studied it in a sterile petri dish. And so we came to believe in disease. When you add back in the intelligence of the microbiome, the intelligence of nature, suddenly in a petri dish, you can see cells repairing themselves. So we only believed in disease when we studied ourselves in isolation. When we study ourselves in the context of nature, we find out we're healing machines and we're resilient. And I think we're capable of far more than we've ever done before.
Wow. All right, I'm going to drop the mic at that point. That's it, dude. Last thing is tell us 3 teachers or teachings that have been influential on your life and your work that our audience might be able to go learn from.
Boy, Charles Eisenstein is a modern one. I think his essay that he wrote right at the beginning of the pandemic or a month or so in, called The Coronation, is a must-read. It's a very well-written essay that I think really speaks to why we needed this virus, why we've created, and the beauty that's going to come out of this, belief in this pandemic and everything else. We have something beautiful happening, and he does a really poetic job of describing why we would have picked Corona, this coronation to happen. And so Corona as the coronation of humanity, we're going to find out that we are much more beautiful than we thought when we come to embrace the viruses that are within us. And he does a really eloquent job of that. So Charles Eisenstein, Coronation. Other teachers that, maybe are overlooked a little bit, I would say, I don't want to get too esoteric because let me think about what next. I mean, ironically, something like, biography of a yogi would be, something in there that, if you want to think about this sea, I think if you read that with new eyes, with the idea of the microbiome, you might see something new of like when we start talking about seas of consciousness and, yoga and, all of this religious history and all these stories and narratives we've told ourselves, repicture that with the intelligence of nature in the mix of it. And realize we've been storytelling around nature and our connection to it through religion since the beginning of time. So read, if you come from the Judeo-Christian thing, read the book of Revelations and look through kind of what's happening in these current days. And it's going to be tempting to say, oh, yeah, it's the end times. But then just ask yourself, has nature ever ended? And are we actually at a rebirth time? And when we start to think about this new Jerusalem or this new world that we're spoken of that's going to emerge from the ashes of the old, what's that phoenix rising? And could we be a part of that instead of waiting for the extinction event to happen and then we all emerge as spiritual beings on the other side? What if we were to play still? And is the rapture actually a description of a loss of massive life due to the toxicity of a planet that can no longer support life, and yet there's a small number left over that get to recreate with Mother Earth again? And so that's an interesting retake on Revelations, and so I'm not trying to be, really flying the face of religion or upset anybody here around, he's trying to rewrite Christianity. No, I'm not at all. I'm just saying we've had a very human perspective on chronic disease, and we misinformed ourselves for that. We're having a very narrow definition of human experience in our interpretation of religion. Should we expand that for a moment and think about life in the context of a deity that you might believe in or ascribe to or whatever? We just need to expand past that human perspective and that umfeld that is so narrow and let it become a sea of consciousness for a moment. And if you'll just do that and meditate into that and just ask yourself right now, are you okay right now? Mm-hmm. And then go watch the news and be like, okay, nothing's good over there, but right now I'm going to meditate and I'm going to just ask myself, am I good right now? Yeah, I'm really good right now. I'm not sick. and everything's good right now. Like that's all we can hold on to is right now for you. Everything might be okay right now. Are you in a little bit of pain? Okay, go explore that, whatever it is. But the reality is we're moving into this higher conscious state. And you said 3. Victor Schauberger's another one. If you want to really blow your mind over a great observer of nature, I'd say Victor Schauberger of the 20th century is one of our unsung heroes and geniuses of that century. So read Victor Schauberger's work and realize that medical science ignored one of its greatest minds in that century because he was a forester, fourth generation forester in the Austrian mountains, and he made better observations about biology and more profound, revolutionary things that we could go and start rebuilding our concept of physiology and the microbiome and all that on Victor's work, and we would be accelerated by 50 years. If we ignore his work, it'll take us 50 years, and we'll be 100 years behind where he was in the mid-century. I think there's a real need to move back to that historic brilliance that was coming out of the 1940s and 50s, because at the same time we were doing pharmaceutical explosion and kind of going down the wrong pathway. A lot of people going down the right pathway at that time. An interesting tipping point right there in the 1940s, 50s, where we chose a pathway to convenience and control of nature instead of a reconnection with her. And we created our sixth extinction for it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Amazing conversation. Thank you for your dedication and energy. There's not many people that can go toe to toe with me for this long and really keep delivering. It's always me that's like just out of guilt. I'm like, okay, this is unethical to make them keep going. But no, really, man, thanks for your time and all the work you're doing in the world. You're a very inspiring and brilliant guy, and it's such a pleasure to be able to sit with people like you. So thank you for the opportunity.
We should keep in mind that I may not be an intelligent human, but I have a good microbiome.
They're doing all the heavy lifting. All right, where can people find your website, social media, all that? We're going to put the Ion Biome product in the show notes and stuff, but any other, your organizations or anything you're doing?
Education through ZachBushMD.com. Lots of different topics I chase there. So ZachBushMD.com can find you into that whole kind of universe of thought. And then our nonprofit, I would love for everybody to jump on there, farmersfootprint.us, so farmersfootprint.us. And it's a good look at our first project within an emerging huge ecosystem of projects that'll focus on soil, water, and air. But our first project within soil is Farmers Footprint. And we would love your support to just log on there, $5, $10, $20, whatever you can. Or if you can really give a significant gift. We're at a real tipping point with that project right now, where we can really start to influence much broader discussion and storytelling at the, post-COVID is really opening up an opportunity for us to really tell a powerful narrative of healing through the food system and through the agricultural system. So it'd be an awesome time for you all to jump in and support that mission at farmersfootprint.us.
Cool, man. All right. Thanks again. And I look forward to doing this next time I see you.
Likewise.